The Christmas Manuscript Murder. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where we explore the depths of human nature through stories that challenge and captivate. I'm your host, William, and today we're venturing into a tale of greed, deception, and justice. Before we begin our journey, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from today. Please share in the comments, as I read every single one. Now, let me take you to the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where Miss Jane Marple finds herself entangled in a most unusual Christmas mystery. Let's begin. The Christmas Manuscript Murder. Chapter 1. The Antiquarian Fair. The first week of December brought an unusual excitement to St. Mary Mead. The village hall had been transformed into a venue for the annual Antiquarian Book Fair, an event that typically took place in London, but had been moved this year due to renovations at the usual location. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her warmest coat and carrying her knitting bag, made her way through the crisp morning air toward the hall. She had always harboured a fondness for old books, their pages whispering of times long past. The hall was already bustling with activity when she arrived. Dealers had set up tables displaying leather-bound volumes, manuscripts yellowed with age, and documents that spoke of centuries gone by. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and the cinnamon from the mulled wine being served near the entrance, a festive touch for the Christmas season. Miss Marple paused at the entrance, her keen blue eyes surveying the scene. There was something particularly animated about the gathering today. She noticed clusters of people surrounding certain tables, their voices rising and falling with excitement. Among the dealers she recognized Mr. Edmund Ashworth, a portly gentleman in his late 50s, who had made quite a name for himself in the rare book trade. He stood behind a prominent table near the centre of the hall, his face flushed with what appeared to be triumph. "Ah, Miss Marple," a voice beside her made her turn. It was Reverend Leonard, the new vicar who had recently taken over the parish. His predecessor had retired to Cornwall, and Reverend Leonard, a scholarly man with a passion for medieval history, had proven to be a welcome addition to the community. "I see you've come to admire the treasures." "Indeed, Reverend," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "I understand there are some quite remarkable pieces on display this year." Remarkable is an understatement. The vicar's eyes lit up behind his spectacles. "Mr. Ashworth has brought a medieval Christmas manuscript. 12th century, if you can believe it. The illuminations are said to be extraordinary. He's displaying it this morning before the auction this evening." "How fascinating," Miss Marple murmured, though something in the vicar's tone suggested a note of concern beneath his enthusiasm. They made their way through the crowd toward Mr. Ashworth's table. The dealer was holding court, a small velvet-lined box open. Before him, inside, cushioned carefully, lay an ancient manuscript. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could see the brilliant colours of the illuminated pages. Gold leaf caught the light, and the intricate details of medieval artistry were visible in the painted borders depicting scenes of the Nativity. "Magnificent, isn't it?" a woman's voice spoke from Miss Marple's other side. She turned to find Sister Agnes, a librarian from the monastery of St. Benedict, some 20 miles away. The nun's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line as she stared at the manuscript. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were clenched tightly at her sides. "You're familiar with such works, Sister?" Miss Marple asked gently. "More than I'd like to be." Sister Agnes replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That manuscript, or one very similar to it, was part of our monastery's collection until 6 months ago. We were told it had been damaged beyond repair in a small fire in our library. We held a funeral service for it, if you can imagine such a thing." Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion arose at Mr. Ashworth's table. The dealer had begun his presentation, donning white cotton gloves with theatrical flair before carefully opening the manuscript. The crowd pressed closer, and Miss Marple found herself being gently pushed forward by the tide of eager spectators. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Ashworth's voice boomed across the hall. "What you see before you is perhaps the finest example of medieval Christmas illumination to come to market in the past decade. This manuscript dates from approximately 1170 and contains portions of the Gospel of Luke, specifically the Nativity narrative, along with hymns and prayers for the Christmas season. The provenance is impeccable, and the condition, as you can see, is remarkable." He turned the pages slowly, reverently, allowing the crowd to admire each illuminated sheet. Miss Marple watched not the manuscript but the faces around her. Sister Agnes had gone even paler, if that were possible. A thin young man with wire-rimmed spectacles, whom she recognised as Mr. Martin Graves, a curator from the British Library, was frowning deeply. And standing at the back of the crowd, partially obscured by a decorative pillar, was a figure in a dark overcoat whose face Miss Marple couldn't quite see but whose posture suggested intense interest. The presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause. Mr. Ashworth announced that the manuscript would remain on display until the auction at 6 o'clock that evening, after which it would be removed to a secure location. As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple noticed Sister Agnes approaching the table. She moved closer, her knitting providing the perfect excuse to linger nearby. Mr. Ashworth. Sister Agnes's voice was steady despite her obvious distress. I must speak with you about this manuscript. I believe there has been a terrible mistake. The dealer's jovial expression cooled noticeably. I'm afraid I don't understand, sister. The manuscript's provenance has been thoroughly vetted. Perhaps you're mistaken. I am not mistaken. The nun's voice rose slightly, drawing curious glances from nearby visitors. That manuscript, or pages from one identical to it, belonged to the monastery of St. Benedict. I know every illumination, every brushstroke. Those are our monastery's treasures. Mr. Ashworth's face reddened. Sister, I must ask you to lower your voice. You're making serious accusations without foundation. This manuscript was acquired through entirely legitimate channels. If your monastery suffered a loss, I'm terribly sorry, but that has nothing to do with my acquisition. I want to examine the pages, Sister Agnes insisted. I can prove what I'm saying. Absolutely not. The manuscript is extremely fragile. Only I and the auction house specialists are permitted to handle it. Mr. Ashworth gestured to a security guard who had materialized nearby. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other clients to attend to. Sister Agnes stood her ground for a moment longer, her face a mixture of anger and desperation, before turning abruptly and walking away. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the rigid set of the nun's shoulders and the way her hands trembled as she clutched her small handbag. The rest of the morning passed pleasantly enough. Miss Marple browsed the various tables, admiring Victorian novels and Georgian poetry collections. She purchased a small volume of Christmas carols, illustrated with charming woodcuts, from a friendly dealer who reminded her of her late brother. All the while, she kept a peripheral awareness of Mr. Ashworth's table, noting who came and went, who lingered too long, and who seemed most interested in the medieval manuscript. Lunchtime brought a brief lull in activity. Many of the dealers and visitors retired to the tea room that had been set up in an adjacent room. Miss Marple found herself sharing a table with Reverend Leonard and Mr. Martin Graves, the British Library curator. It's an extraordinary piece, Mr. Graves was saying, stirring his tea with unnecessary vigour. But something about it troubles me. The illuminations are certainly period appropriate, and the craftsmanship is superb. Yet, there's something, I can't quite put my finger on it. The binding, perhaps, Reverend Leonard suggested. It looks rather new for such an old manuscript. Mr. Graves shook his head. No, the binding has been restored, which is common practice. It's something else. He paused, lowering his voice. I've heard whispers in professional circles about Mr. Ashworth. Nothing proven, mind you, but suggestions that some of his acquisitions might not be entirely as represented. That's quite an accusation, the Reverend said, looking shocked. Which is why they remain whispers, Mr. Graves replied. But if Sister Agnes's claims have any merit, well, it bears investigation. Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing, but her mind was working rapidly. She thought of Sister Agnes's certainty, of Mr. Ashworth's defensive reaction, and of that shadowy figure at the back of the crowd whose face she still hadn't seen clearly. The afternoon brought renewed crowds as the auction hour approached. Miss Marple returned to the main hall, finding a seat with a good view of Mr. Ashworth's table. The manuscript remained in its velvet-lined box, now enclosed in a glass display case. Mr. Ashworth himself was in high spirits, accepting congratulations from fellow dealers and making grand predictions about the final auction price. At precisely 4 o'clock, Mr. Ashworth announced he would give one final presentation of the manuscript before it was secured for the evening. He unlocked the glass case with a small key hung on a chain around his neck, donned his white gloves once more, and carefully removed the manuscript from its box. This time, Miss Marple positioned herself closer to the front, her eyes fixed not on the manuscript but on Mr. Ashworth's hands. He turned the pages slowly, providing commentary on each illumination. The Annunciation to the Shepherds, the Adoration of the Magi, the Flight into Egypt. His fingers, protected by the white gloves, moved across the ancient vellum with practiced ease. 20 minutes later, the presentation concluded. Mr. Ashworth carefully returned the manuscript to its box and locked it back in the display case. He removed his gloves and wiped his brow with a handkerchief. It had grown warm in the crowded hall. Miss Marple watched as the dealer made his way toward the tea room, presumably for refreshment before the auction. She noticed that his gait seemed slightly unsteady, and he paused once to lean against a doorframe. Several people approached him with questions, but he waved them off with uncharacteristic irritation. The auction was scheduled to begin at 6 o'clock in the main hall. By 5:30, the chairs had been arranged in rows facing a podium, where the auctioneer, a brisk woman from London named Mrs. Hartford, was setting up her equipment. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The Christmas manuscript was the star lot of the evening. At 5:45, someone screamed. Miss Marple, along with everyone else in the vicinity, rushed toward the sound. It had come from the corridor leading to the tea room. They found Mr. Ashworth collapsed on the floor, his face contorted in what appeared to be extreme pain. His breathing was laboured, and his skin had taken on an alarming grey pallor. "Call an ambulance," Reverend Leonard shouted, kneeling beside the stricken man. "Someone call immediately." Dr. Haydock, the village physician who had been attending the fair out of general interest, pushed through the crowd. He examined Mr. Ashworth quickly, his expression growing grave. "Stand back, everyone. Give him air." But it was clear even to Miss Marple's untrained eye that Mr. Ashworth was beyond help. His breathing grew more shallow, his movements more feeble. Within minutes, despite Dr. Haydock's efforts, Edmund Ashworth was dead. The village hall erupted into chaos. Mrs. Hartford, the auctioneer, immediately cancelled the evening's proceedings. The security guard contacted the police. Visitors and dealers alike stood in shocked clusters, whispering and speculating. Miss Marple remained where she was, her knitting forgotten in her bag, her mind racing through the events of the day. Dr. Haydock rose from beside the body, his face troubled. He spoke quietly to Reverend Leonard, but Miss Marple was close enough to hear. "I'll need to wait for the official examination, of course, but the symptoms suggest poisoning. Some kind of toxin that acts quickly." Poisoning. The word rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Miss Marple's gaze travelled slowly across the faces surrounding her. Sister Agnes stood near the wall, her face ashen but her eyes dry and strangely calm. Mr. Graves had his hand pressed to his mouth, looking genuinely horrified. And there, finally stepping out from behind that same decorative pillar, was the figure in the dark overcoat. Miss Marple could see him clearly now, a man in his early 40s with thinning hair and a scar along his left cheek. He was staring at Mr. Ashworth's body with an expression she couldn't quite read. The police arrived within the hour. Inspector Slack, who Miss Marple had encountered before and who regarded her with a mixture of respect and exasperation, took charge of the scene. The village hall was sealed. Statements were taken from everyone present. The manuscript, along with all of Mr. Ashworth's other items, was secured as potential evidence. As Miss Marple finally made her way home through the dark December evening, her mind returned again and again to those white cotton gloves, to Mr. Ashworth's fingers turning the pages of the medieval manuscript, and to the look of strange calm on Sister Agnes's face as she stood beside the body of the man she had accused just hours earlier. Something, Miss Marple reflected as she unlocked her cottage door, was very wrong indeed, and like the intricate illuminations in that ancient manuscript, the truth was hidden beneath layers that would require careful examination to reveal. Chapter 2. The Pages of Deception. The morning after Mr. Ashworth's death dawned grey and cold, a fitting atmosphere for the pall that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and attended to her small garden despite the chill. Her roses needed preparing for winter, and she found that physical work often helped clarify her thoughts. As she worked, she reflected on the events of the previous day. The image of Mr. Ashworth handling the manuscript kept returning to her mind. Those white cotton gloves, standard practice when dealing with fragile historical documents, had seemed such an ordinary detail at the time. Now, in light of his sudden death, they took on a more sinister significance. She was interrupted in her musings by the arrival of Constable Polk, looking uncomfortable in his uniform as he approached her garden gate. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," he said, touching his helmet respectfully. "Inspector Slack would like a word with you at your convenience about yesterday's unfortunate incident." "Of course, Constable." Miss Marple removed her gardening gloves and brushed the soil from her coat. "Shall I come to the station, or is the inspector nearby?" "He's at the village hall, miss, still examining the scene. He said you could come by this morning if it suited." An hour later, Miss Marple made her way to the village hall. The Christmas decorations that had seemed so festive the day before now appeared incongruous against the backdrop of a death investigation. Police tape cordoned off certain areas, and officers moved systematically through the space, photographing and collecting evidence. Inspector Slack stood near Mr. Ashworth's table, which had been left largely undisturbed. The manuscript in its glass case sat locked and untouched, its brilliant illuminations seeming to mock the tragedy that had unfolded. "Miss Marple." The inspector greeted her with a curt nod. "Thank you for coming. I understand you were present for most of the day yesterday, including Mr. Ashworth's presentations of the manuscript." "Yes, Inspector." "I arrived shortly after the fair opened and remained until the unfortunate event." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "The preliminary examination by Dr. Haydock, confirmed by the police surgeon, suggests that Mr. Ashworth died from contact with some form of poison, a toxin absorbed through the skin. The symptoms are consistent with certain plant-based alkaloids, though we're awaiting full laboratory results." "Contact poison," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Then the source would have been something he touched." "Precisely." The inspector's expression was grim. "We're examining everything on his person, his clothing, his handkerchief, the teacup he used. But there's another possibility that I must consider." "The manuscript," Miss Marple said quietly. Inspector Slack looked at her sharply. "You've thought of it too, then?" "Yes, the manuscript. If someone wanted to kill Mr. Ashworth and had access to the manuscript beforehand, they could have treated the pages with poison. When he handled it with his bare hands— No, wait, he wore gloves." "He wore gloves during the presentations," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But I observed him examining the manuscript briefly before the first presentation, adjusting its position in the box. His hands were ungloved then. And there was another moment, just before lunch, when I saw him touch the edges of several pages without gloves. He seemed to be checking something about the binding." The inspector made rapid notes. "This is crucial, Miss Marple. If the manuscript was treated with contact poison, we need to know exactly when and how Mr. Ashworth came into contact with it." He paused, then added, "The manuscript itself must be examined, but we'll need a specialist who can do so safely." By mid-morning, the village hall had become a hub of activity. A toxicologist from London arrived, along with a manuscript expert from the British Museum. Miss Marple remained at the inspector's request, observing from a discreet distance as they began their painstaking examination of the medieval manuscript. The glass case was opened with extreme caution. The manuscript expert, a Dr. Patricia Thornton, wore not only gloves but also a protective gown and mask. Using specialized equipment, she began to examine the pages under various types of light and with chemical tests that Miss Marple didn't fully understand but found fascinating nonetheless. After nearly 2 hours, Dr. Thornton stepped back from the manuscript and removed her protective gear. Her face was grave as she spoke to Inspector Slack in a low voice. Miss Marple, positioned near enough to hear, kept her eyes on her knitting while her ears remained alert. 3 of the pages show traces of a substance consistent with toxins derived from monkshood, also known as aconitum. Dr. Thornton explained. The poison was applied to the vellum in a way that would be nearly invisible to the naked eye. It's absorbed rapidly through skin contact, and the effects can manifest within hours. "Which pages specifically?" Inspector Slack asked. the Annunciation to the Shepherds, the Adoration of the Magi, and the Flight into Egypt. Dr. Thornton replied, "Interestingly, these are the most heavily illuminated pages, the ones most likely to be handled and admired during a presentation." A chill ran through Miss Marple at these words. Someone had deliberately selected the most beautiful pages, the ones that would draw the most attention and handling, to carry death. The toxicologist, a Dr. Patel, added his findings. The concentration was substantial enough to be lethal, particularly with repeated contact. If Mr. Ashworth handled these pages multiple times yesterday, which witness statements suggest he did, the cumulative dose would certainly be fatal. Inspector Slack's face darkened. So we're looking at premeditated murder. Someone had to have had access to the manuscript before it came to the fair, applied the poison, and known that Mr. Ashworth would handle it extensively during his presentations. "The question is who?" Dr. Thornton said. "And why?" Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "If I may, Inspector, there was a considerable dispute yesterday morning between Mr. Ashworth and Sister Agnes from the Monastery of St. Benedict. She claimed that the manuscript, or pages from one identical to it, had belonged to her monastery's collection." Inspector Slack nodded. "Yes, I have statements about that confrontation. Sister Agnes has been asked to remain available for questioning." He paused, then asked, "What's your impression of her, Miss Marple? You have a way of reading people." Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "Sister Agnes struck me as a woman of deep conviction and genuine distress. When she looked at the manuscript, there was no doubt in my mind that she recognized it. But whether that distress would drive her to murder, she hesitated. People are capable of surprising things when they believe a great wrong has been committed, particularly when it involves something sacred." The inspector made more notes, then looked up. "There's something else you should know. We've been investigating Mr. Ashworth's business dealings. It appears he may have been involved in some questionable practices. The Metropolitan Police have had their eye on him for some time." "What sort of questionable practices?" Miss Marple asked. "Forgeries, alterations, fraudulent provenance claims. Nothing proven, mind you, but enough smoke to suggest fire. Dr. Thornton here has also made an interesting discovery about this particular manuscript." The manuscript expert nodded. "I've had a chance to examine it more closely, and while the illuminations are certainly medieval and of extremely high quality, there are inconsistencies. Some of the pages appear to be original 12th century work, while others, though brilliant, show signs of being slightly later editions or very skilled restorations. The binding is definitely modern, probably done within the last year. So the manuscript itself is not entirely authentic," Miss Marple said. "It's complicated," Dr. Thornton replied. "The core illuminated pages appear genuine, but the text pages interspersed between them are more questionable. It's as if someone took several genuine illuminated leaves and created a composite manuscript around them." "A forgery, then," Inspector Slack said. "A sophisticated one, if so," Dr. Thornton corrected. "The illuminations themselves are authentic medieval work, but their arrangement in this particular manuscript may have been done by Mr. Ashworth or someone working with him." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. So Mr. Ashworth may have been taking valuable pages from various manuscripts, perhaps even from the Monastery of St. Benedict, as Sister Agnes claimed, and reassembling them into new combinations to sell. "That's what we suspect." The inspector agreed. It would explain Sister Agnes's recognition of the illuminations, while Mr. Ashworth insisted the complete manuscript had impeccable provenance. He was probably telling a partial truth. The individual pages may have legitimate histories, but not as part of this particular manuscript. And if Sister Agnes discovered this deception, Miss Marple said quietly, if she realized that her monastery's treasures had been stolen and reassembled for profit, might that provide a motive for murder? The inspector's expression was non-committal. "It's one theory, but there are others we must explore. That young man from the British Library, Mr. Graves, has been asking pointed questions about Mr. Ashworth's dealings. And there's a gentleman named Michael Hardwick who was observed at the fair yesterday. He has a criminal record related to art theft. We're trying to locate him for questioning." Miss Marple remembered the figure in the dark overcoat, the man with the scar on his cheek. She mentioned this to the inspector, who immediately became more alert. "Can you describe him more fully?" She did so, and Inspector Slack nodded with satisfaction. That's Hardwick, all right. He's been linked to several cases of stolen manuscripts and rare books. If he was at the fair, he must have had some interest in Mr. Ashworth or the manuscript. The rest of the afternoon was spent in careful documentation of the evidence. The manuscript was secured as crucial evidence, along with all of Mr. Ashworth's belongings. The toxicologist took samples for further analysis, and Dr. Thornton prepared a detailed report on the manuscript's composition and authenticity. As evening approached, Miss Marple made her way home through the gathering dusk. The village streets were quiet, most residents staying indoors. Whether from the cold or from unease about the murder, she couldn't say. She had just reached her cottage when she noticed a figure standing near her garden gate. As she drew closer, she recognized Sister Agnes, still wearing the same simple dark coat from the previous day. The nun's face was drawn and pale in the fading light. "Miss Marple." Sister Agnes's voice was urgent. "Please, I must speak with you. I don't know who else to turn to." "Come inside," Miss Marple said immediately, unlocking her door. "You look frozen through." In the warmth of Miss Marple's sitting room, with a cup of hot tea in her hands, Sister Agnes began to speak. The words came haltingly at first, then in a rush. "I didn't kill him," she said. "I know how it must look. I confronted him publicly about the manuscript, and then he died. But I swear to you, I did not poison those pages." Miss Marple studied the nun's face carefully. "Tell me about the manuscript from your monastery, the one you say was damaged in a fire." Sister Agnes set down her teacup, her hands trembling. 6 months ago, we had a small fire in the library. It was contained quickly, but we were told that several manuscripts had been damaged by smoke and water. Among them was our greatest treasure, a 12th century gospel containing the most beautiful illuminations of the Christmas story. The abbot held a service for it. We mourned its loss as we would mourn a person. "But it wasn't destroyed," Miss Marple said gently. "Not entirely." Sister Agnes's voice broke. "When I saw those pages yesterday, I knew immediately. Those illuminations of the Annunciation, the Adoration, the Flight, they were from our gospel. I could identify every detail. The way the angels' wings are painted, the exact shade of blue in Mary's robe, the tiny rabbit hiding in the corner of the flight into Egypt scene. Our manuscript was famous for such details. Who handled the damaged manuscripts after the fire?" The nun's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Benedict Walker, a book restorer who had done work for the monastery before. He was recommended by someone in London. He took the damaged manuscripts away, said he would assess whether anything could be salvaged. 2 months later, he returned with ashes and a report saying the manuscripts were too far gone to save. We accepted his word because we had no reason not to trust him. And now you think he lied," Miss Marple said. "You think he removed the valuable illuminated pages and sold them to Mr. Ashworth." "I'm certain of it," Sister Agnes said firmly. "Mr. Ashworth must have commissioned the theft, or at least bought the pages knowing they were stolen. Then he had them incorporated into this composite manuscript with false provenance. It's not just theft, Miss Marple, it's desecration. Did you tell Inspector Slack all of this?" "I tried to, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. A nun with a grievance against the victim, claiming stolen church property. It sounds like the perfect motive for murder." She looked directly at Miss Marple. "But I am not a murderer. My vows forbid it, and more than that, my conscience would never allow it, no matter how wronged I felt." Miss Marple poured more tea, her mind working through the implications. "Tell me, sister, this book restorer, Benedict Walker, where is he now?" "I don't know. The monastery tried to contact him about another project 3 months ago, but his business premises were closed. He seems to have disappeared." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And the person in London who recommended him. Do you know who that was?" Sister Agnes frowned, trying to remember. "I believe it was someone from the British Library. The abbot has the correspondence." "I could find out." "Please do," Miss Marple said. "And one more question, sister. You recognized the manuscript immediately. Could anyone else from your monastery have done the same?" The nun considered this. "Father Prior certainly would have. He catalogued our collection. And Brother Simon, our librarian, he knows every manuscript intimately. But neither of them came to the fair. They don't even know about it. Are you certain of that? Sister Agnes hesitated. Well, I told them I was coming. I explained that there was an antiquarian fair in St. Mary Mead, and that I wanted to see what was on offer. But I didn't mention Mr. Ashworth specifically, or his Christmas manuscript. I only learned about it when I arrived. After Sister Agnes left, promising to provide the information about the book restorer's recommendation, Miss Marple sat by her fire and considered everything she had learned. The manuscript was a composite of valuable illuminated pages stolen from a monastery and assembled into a fraudulent whole. The dealer was dead, poisoned by the very pages he had presumably acquired through theft and deception, and there was a missing book restorer who might hold the key to everything. But Miss Marple's experience with human nature told her that simple answers were rarely correct. Sister Agnes's grief seemed genuine. Her shock at Mr. Ashworth's death appeared real. Yet the poison had been applied to those specific pages, the ones from her monastery. Was that coincidence, or was someone deliberately framing the nun? She thought of the other faces she had seen at the fair. Mr. Graves from the British Library, who had recommended the book restorer. Michael Hardwick, the known criminal with the scarred face. Dr. Thornton, the manuscript expert who seemed almost too knowledgeable about the composite nature of the document. Even Reverend Leonard, with his professed interest in medieval history. The threads of this case, Miss Marple reflected, were as intricately woven as the illuminations in that deadly manuscript. And somewhere among those threads was a killer who had used beauty itself as a weapon. Chapter 3. The Restorer's Secret. The following morning brought unexpected visitors to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple was tending to her indoor plants when she heard the commotion outside. Through her front window she observed a police car pull up, followed by a private vehicle from which emerged a tall, elderly man in ecclesiastical garb and a younger man in a monk's habit. Within the hour, Miss Marple received a telephone call from Inspector Slack, requesting her presence at the village hall. When she arrived, she found the inspector in conversation with the two men she had seen earlier. Sister Agnes stood to one side, her face a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Miss Marple, allow me to introduce Abbot Thomas from the monastery of St. Benedict," Inspector Slack said. "And this is Brother Simon, their librarian." The abbot extended his hand with grave courtesy. "Miss Marple, I understand you've been most helpful in this tragic affair. Sister Agnes speaks highly of your discretion and insight." Miss Marple acknowledged this with a modest nod. "I'm pleased to meet you both, though I wish it were under happier circumstances." The abbot's expression grew stern. "Happier, indeed. We've come because Sister Agnes telephoned us last evening with disturbing news about our manuscript. I've brought Brother Simon because he can identify our gospel beyond any doubt." Brother Simon was a scholarly-looking man, in his mid-30s, with thoughtful eyes and ink-stained fingers. He approached the glass case where the manuscript remained secured, and even from several feet away, Miss Marple could see his face transform with recognition and grief. "That is the work of Brother Anselm," he said softly, his voice carrying in the quiet hall. "The illuminations are unmistakable, the way the gold leaf catches the light, the specific pigments used for the blue, the inclusion of small animals in the borders. These are pages from our Christmas Gospel. I would stake my life on it." Inspector Slack made careful notes. "Can you provide documentation of your monastery's ownership?" Abbot Thomas produced a leather folder from his case. "We have photographs of the complete manuscript taken 5 years ago for our archives. You'll see that these illuminated pages match perfectly. We also have the original catalogue entry from 1875, when the Gospel was first properly documented, and records going back much further in our monastery's annals." Dr. Thornton, who had remained at the hall to continue her examination, studied the photographs carefully. "These are indeed the same illuminations," she confirmed. "The match is exact, which means Mr. Ashworth's claims of legitimate provenance were false, unless he was deceived himself," Miss Marple suggested quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. If this book restorer, Mr. Benedict Walker, provided false documentation along with the pages, Mr. Ashworth might have believed he was purchasing legitimately. "That's a generous interpretation," Inspector Slack said dryly. "Given what we're learning about Mr. Ashworth's reputation, perhaps." Miss Marple agreed. But it's important to establish the chain of custody. Who stole the pages, who knew they were stolen, and who might have had both the knowledge and means to apply poison to them. Brother Simon had been listening intently. May I ask when the poison was applied? Was it recently, or could it have been done months ago? Dr. Patel, the toxicologist, answered this. Based on the concentration and the condition of the vellum, I'd estimate the poison was applied within the past 2 weeks, possibly less. Plant-based alkaloids like aconitum do degrade over time, and these were still highly potent. So, the poisoning was done specifically for the fair, Inspector Slack said. The killer knew Mr. Ashworth would be handling the manuscript here, or the killer was someone who had recent access to the manuscript, Miss Marple added. Someone who knew it would be displayed and handled extensively. The inspector consulted his notes. We've been trying to trace Mr. Ashworth's movements in the days leading up to the fair. According to his assistant, a Miss Cordelia Price, the manuscript was kept in a secure storage facility in London until 3 days before the fair. Mr. Ashworth retrieved it himself and transported it here in a specially designed case. Was anyone else present when he retrieved it? Miss Marple asked. Inspector Slack shook his head. Miss Price says he went alone. He was very particular about security, apparently. Didn't trust anyone else with his most valuable pieces. Then the poison must have been applied either at the storage facility before he collected it, or here in St. Mary Mead before the fair opened, Miss Marple reasoned. Unless there's another possibility we haven't considered. Abbot Thomas cleared his throat. Inspector, there's something else you should know. When we were investigating the fire that supposedly damaged our manuscripts, we found something odd. The fire originated in a storage room where cleaning supplies were kept, not in the library itself. Yet the manuscripts damaged were specifically the most valuable ones from a locked cabinet in a completely different part of the building. You're suggesting the fire was deliberately set to cover a theft, Inspector Slack said. That's exactly what I'm suggesting, the abbot replied. And I believe Benedict Walker was complicit in it, if not the actual perpetrator. Do you have any proof of this? Not definitive proof, no. But Brother Simon discovered something interesting when he was sorting through the ashes that Walker returned to us. The librarian nodded. Among the ash and charred vellum, I found fragments that didn't match our manuscripts. The vellum was of inferior quality, the ink composition wrong. I believe Walker burned different, less valuable manuscripts and mixed their ashes with small amounts of our actual manuscripts to make his deception convincing. Inspector Slack's expression grew intent. That's quite an elaborate fraud. It suggests planning and expertise. Do you have any idea where Walker might be now? We've been searching for him, Abbot Thomas said. His business premises in London are closed, as Sister Agnes discovered. But I took the liberty of making inquiries through our network of monasteries and religious houses. Walker did restoration work for several of them over the years. And what did you learn? The inspector asked. That he was recommended to all of us by the same source, a curator at the British Library named Martin Graves. A heavy silence fell over the room. Miss Marple glanced at Inspector Slack, whose face had gone very still. Mr. Graves was at the fair, the inspector said quietly. He was one of the people who observed Mr. Ashworth's presentations of the manuscript. Miss Marple's mind raced ahead, and Mr. Graves expressed concern about the manuscript's authenticity. He said something about whispers in professional circles regarding Mr. Ashworth's practices. Inspector Slack immediately dispatched an officer to locate Mr. Graves, who was staying at the local inn. Within 20 minutes, the curator was escorted to the village hall, looking puzzled and somewhat offended. I don't understand what this is about, Mr. Graves said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. I came to the fair as a professional observer, nothing more. Inspector Slack's voice was stern. Mr. Graves, we understand you recommended a book restorer named Benedict Walker to several institutions, including the monastery of St. Benedict. Is that correct? The curator paled slightly. Yes, I recommended Ben Walker. He was highly skilled, came with excellent references. What's this about? When did you last see or speak with Mr. Walker? Mr. Graves hesitated. I'm not sure. Several months ago, perhaps. We occasionally consulted on projects. Did you know that manuscripts restored by Mr. Walker have subsequently appeared in altered form on the rare book market? The curator's face flushed with indignation. I certainly did not. Are you accusing me of being involved in manuscript theft? I'm asking if you were aware of any irregularities in Mr. Walker's work, the inspector said evenly. No, absolutely not. If there were such irregularities, I was completely ignorant of them. Mr. Graves looked genuinely distressed. I recommended him in good faith. His early work was exemplary. Miss Marple, who had been observing the curator carefully, spoke up. Mr. Graves, when you examined Mr. Ashworth's manuscript yesterday, you said you felt something was wrong with it. What specifically troubled you? The curator turned to her, seeming grateful for a less accusatory question. The composition felt wrong. The illuminations were magnificent, clearly authentic medieval work, but their arrangement didn't follow any liturgical pattern I recognized. It was as if someone had assembled a greatest hits collection rather than a coherent manuscript. Could Benedict Walker have created such a composite, she asked. The curator considered this. Ben was certainly skilled enough. But why would he? Unless his expression changed as understanding dawned. Unless he was stealing pages from various manuscripts and reassembling them to obscure their origin. Inspector Slack leaned forward. And if you suspected this, if you had evidence of it, might that have given you a reason to confront Mr. Ashworth? I didn't confront anyone, Mr. Graves protested. I was concerned about the manuscript's authenticity, yes, but I intended to examine it more carefully and make a formal report if necessary. I certainly didn't poison the man. The inspector wasn't finished. Where were you 3 days ago, Mr. Graves? When Mr. Ashworth retrieved the manuscript from storage in London. I was at the British Library working in my office. My colleagues can confirm it. And yesterday morning, before the fair opened. Where were you then? Mr. Graves stammered slightly. I arrived early, around 8 o'clock. I wanted to examine the displays before the crowds arrived. I walked around the hall for perhaps half an hour, then had breakfast at a cafe in the village. Did you go near Mr. Ashworth's table during that time? The curator's silence was answer enough. Inspector Slack pressed the point. Well, Mr. Graves, I may have glanced at it. Mr. Graves admitted. The manuscript was already displayed in its case. The case was locked. I didn't touch anything. But you knew about the manuscript's existence before the fair. Miss Marple said gently. You knew Mr. Ashworth would be displaying it here. Mr. Graves's shoulders sagged. Yes, I knew. Ben Walker contacted me 3 weeks ago. It was the first I'd heard from him in months. He was agitated, said he needed to tell me something important about manuscripts he'd worked on. He mentioned Mr. Ashworth's name and this fair. Then he disappeared before we could meet. Where is Benedict Walker now? Inspector Slack demanded. I don't know. The curator's voice was strained. I've been trying to find him. His phone is disconnected. His flat is empty. It's as if he vanished deliberately, or as if someone wanted him to vanish. Miss Marple murmured. After Mr. Graves was dismissed with warnings not to leave the area, Miss Marple found herself alone with Inspector Slack and the monastery delegation. The inspector looked frustrated. We have too many suspects and not enough solid evidence, he said. Sister Agnes had motive and was present at the fair. Mr. Graves had knowledge and opportunity. This missing restorer, Walker, is connected to the whole scheme, but has conveniently disappeared. And then there's Michael Hardwick, the known criminal, who was lurking about but hasn't been located yet. Miss Marple had been thinking about the sequence of events. Inspector, may I make a suggestion? The key to this case lies not with who wanted Mr. Ashworth dead, but with who had the specific knowledge required to carry out this particular murder. What do you mean? The inspector asked. Consider what was required, Miss Marple explained. The killer needed to know about aconitum poisoning and how to prepare and apply it safely. They needed to know which pages of the manuscript Mr. Ashworth would handle most frequently. They needed access to the manuscript at a time when they could apply the poison without being observed. And they needed to understand medieval manuscripts well enough to treat the vellum without damaging the illuminations. Brother Simon had been listening intently. That's a very specific set of skills. Someone with knowledge of both medieval manuscripts and botanical toxins. Exactly. Miss Marple agreed. How many people possess that combination of expertise? Inspector Slack pulled out his phone and began making calls. Within an hour, they had assembled a disturbing picture. Aconitum, or monkshood, was a plant that grew wild in certain areas, but was also cultivated by specialists. The monastery itself, it turned out, had a medicinal garden that included monkshood, carefully tended for its historical significance, though no longer used in medicine. Brother Simon maintained that garden. Abbot Thomas said quietly, his face troubled, "He's our herbalist as well as our librarian." The young monk looked stricken. "Yes, I tend the garden, but I would never use those plants to harm anyone. My vows as a healer." "No one is accusing you, brother," Miss Marple said gently. "But the fact remains that someone with your knowledge of both manuscripts and herbs would be capable of this crime." "There are others with similar knowledge," Brother Simon said desperately. "Medieval historians who study herbalism, museum conservators who work with plant-based pigments and understand their chemistry." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed. And that brings us back to Benedict Walker, the restorer who has disappeared, and to whoever else might have been working with him in this scheme to steal and sell manuscript pages. As evening drew in, Inspector Slack received a call that changed everything. A body had been found in the River Thames in London, identified through dental records as Benedict Walker. He had been dead for approximately 3 weeks. The room erupted with questions, but Miss Marple sat very still, her mind assembling the pieces of an increasingly complex puzzle. If Walker had been dead for 3 weeks, he couldn't have applied the poison to the manuscript 3 days ago, which meant someone else had done it, someone who knew about Walker's scheme, who had access to the manuscript after Mr. Ashworth collected it from storage, and who had both the knowledge and the motive to kill. The answer, Miss Marple realized, lay not in who stole the manuscript pages originally, but in who discovered the theft and decided to take justice into their own hands. And there was one person who fit that description perfectly, someone who had been present from the very beginning, but whose role she had not fully considered until now. She looked up to find Inspector Slack watching her expectantly. "You've thought of something, Miss Marple," he said. "I believe I have," she replied quietly. "But I need to verify one detail before I can be certain." Inspector, was Dr. Thornton, the manuscript expert, already here in St. Mary Mead on the morning the fair opened? The inspector checked his notes. She arrived the evening before, actually. Stayed at the same inn as Mr. Graves. Said she wanted to examine some of the displays before the crowds arrived. And did she have expertise in medieval herbalism as part of her manuscript studies? Inspector Slack made a quick phone call to the British Museum. When he hung up, his face was grim. Dr. Thornton wrote her doctoral thesis on medieval medical manuscripts and the botanical pigments used in their illuminations. She's considered an expert on both subjects. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then I believe we should speak with Dr. Thornton again. And this time, perhaps, we should ask her about her relationship with Benedict Walker." Chapter 4. The Illuminator's Vengeance. Dr. Patricia Thornton was found in her room at the inn, packing her belongings into a leather valise. She looked up without surprise when Inspector Slack and Miss Marple appeared at her door, accompanied by a uniformed constable. "I've been expecting this," she said calmly, gesturing for them to enter. "Please, sit down. The room's small but adequate." The manuscript expert settled herself in the room's single armchair, while the others arranged themselves as best they could. Miss Marple took a seat on the edge of the bed, her knitting bag in her lap, her eyes never leaving Dr. Thornton's face. Inspector Slack began the questioning. "Dr. Thornton, we need to ask you about your relationship with Benedict Walker." The woman's composed expression barely flickered. "Ben was my half-brother. Same mother, different fathers. He took our mother's maiden name for his business. Said it sounded more trustworthy for a restorer than Thornton." The inspector leaned forward. "Why didn't you mention this connection earlier?" "Because I knew how it would look," Dr. Thornton replied. "My brother had gotten himself involved in something illegal, and when I realized Mr. Ashworth had been murdered by poisoned manuscript pages, I knew suspicion would fall on me if our relationship came to light." "When did you learn about your brother's involvement with Mr. Ashworth?" Miss Marple asked gently. 3 months ago." Dr. Thornton's voice remained steady, but her hands had begun to tremble slightly. Ben came to me, very agitated. He said he'd been approached by Mr. Ashworth several years earlier with a proposition. Mr. Ashworth would identify valuable manuscripts in vulnerable collections, manuscripts that could be damaged accidentally or stolen without too much suspicion. Ben would carry out the thefts or create the circumstances for them, then restore the manuscripts for Mr. Ashworth, who would sell them on the black market. "So your brother was the inside man," Inspector Slack said. "Yes." Dr. Thornton's expression showed disgust. I was horrified, of course. I told him he had to stop, had to confess and return what he'd stolen. He promised he would. He was genuinely remorseful, said he'd been blinded by the money and the excitement of it. He planned to go to the authorities after Christmas. But he never got the chance, Miss Marple said quietly. "No." Dr. Thornton's composure cracked slightly. He was found in the Thames 3 weeks ago. The police called it an accident, said he'd been drinking and fell in. But Ben didn't drink. He was murdered, I'm certain of it. "By whom?" Inspector Slack asked sharply. "I don't know for certain." Dr. Thornton looked directly at them. "But I suspect it was someone connected to Mr. Ashworth. Perhaps Ashworth himself, tying up loose ends. Or perhaps someone else involved in their scheme who decided my brother had become a liability." Miss Marple's needles had begun their rhythmic clicking. "Dr. Thornton, you arrived in St. Mary Mead the evening before the fair opened. Can you account for your movements that night and the following morning?" The manuscript expert's jaw tightened. "I had dinner at the inn, then went to my room. In the morning I had breakfast at 7, then walked to the village hall. It opened early for the dealers to set up. I wanted to examine the displays, particularly Mr. Ashworth's manuscript. I'd heard rumours about it, and suspected it might contain pages my brother had helped steal. Did you touch the manuscript?" Dr. Thornton hesitated for a long moment. "Yes," she said finally. "I did. The case was locked, but I know locks. I spent 15 minutes with that manuscript examining every page. That's when I confirmed my suspicions. Those illuminations came from at least 3 different manuscripts that my brother had access to. The Christmas Gospel from St. Benedict was the most obvious, but there were also pages from a French monastery, and possibly one from Spain. Mr. Ashworth had created a forgery in the sense that he'd assembled something that never existed as a unified work. Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed, and during those 15 minutes alone with the manuscript, did you apply poison to certain pages? No, Dr. Thornton said firmly. When I examined that manuscript, there was no poison on it. I would have noticed. I know what to look for. How can you be certain? The inspector pressed. Because I tested for it. Dr. Thornton reached into her valise and pulled out a small testing kit. I'm an expert in medieval manuscripts, Inspector. I know that toxic substances were sometimes used in pigments and bindings. It's standard practice for me to test manuscripts I examine, particularly ones with questionable provenance. When I tested those pages that morning, they were clean. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. So the poison was applied some time after your examination, but before Mr. Ashworth's first presentation to the public. Exactly, Dr. Thornton said, which was why I couldn't be the killer. I left the village hall at 8:30 and didn't return until the fair officially opened at 10. Where did you go during those 90 minutes? Inspector Slack asked. I walked around the village thinking about what to do with what I'd discovered. I knew I should go to the police about Mr. Ashworth's fraudulent manuscript, but I was afraid it would lead to questions about my brother's death. I was still debating with myself when I returned to the hall. Inspector Slack made careful notes. We'll need to verify your movements. Are there any witnesses who can confirm you were elsewhere during that time? Dr. Thornton shook her head. I walked alone. I saw a few early morning dog walkers, but I don't know if they'd remember me. After Dr. Thornton was taken to the police station for further questioning, Miss Marple and Inspector Slack stood in the inn's courtyard, considering what they'd learned. Do you believe her? The inspector asked. About the manuscript being clean when she examined it? I think I do, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. She would have no reason to test for poison unless she genuinely wanted to ensure the manuscript's safety. And if she'd applied the poison herself, she certainly wouldn't have mentioned the testing kit. Which means someone else had access to the manuscript between 8:30 and 10 o'clock. Inspector Slack said grimly. We need to find out who was in the village hall during that window. They returned to the village hall where the constable on duty had been maintaining a log of everyone who had entered the building since the murder. Miss Marple and the inspector reviewed the previous day's security footage, which, fortunately, had been installed specifically for the antiquarian fair. The footage showed Dr. Thornton arriving at 7:45, examining Mr. Ashworth's table carefully and leaving at 8:32, just as she had claimed. The hall then remained empty except for a caretaker organising chairs until 8:50, when a figure entered through a side door. Miss Marple peered at the screen. "Who is that?" "The person is keeping their face." Turned away from the camera. "Too deliberately." Inspector Slack agreed. "They know where the cameras are positioned." He zoomed in on the figure. Medium height, wearing a long dark coat and a hat pulled low. Could be anyone. They watched as the figure moved directly to Mr. Ashworth's table, worked at the lock on the display case with surprising efficiency, and opened it. The figure's hands, covered in gloves, were visible as they carefully opened the manuscript and appeared to apply something to specific pages using what looked like a small brush or applicator. The whole operation took less than 5 minutes. Then the figure closed and relocked the case, looked around carefully and exited through the same side door. The timestamp showed 9:03. "We need to identify that person," Inspector Slack said, his voice tense with frustration. "The coat is nondescript, the hat obscures their features, and their body language tells us nothing definitive." Miss Marple had been studying the footage intently. "Inspector, could you play that section again, when the person is working with the manuscript?" He did so, and Miss Marple watched with keen attention. "There," she said softly. "Do you see how they hold the brush, the angle of the wrist, the delicate precision of the movement?" "What about it?" the inspector asked. "That's not the movement of someone applying poison carelessly or in haste," Miss Marple explained. "That's the trained hand of someone who works with manuscripts regularly, someone who knows how to apply substances to vellum without damaging it. It requires years of practice. So we're looking for another manuscript expert or restorer," Inspector Slack said. "Someone other than Dr. Thornton." "Or someone who learned from a manuscript expert," Miss Marple suggested. "An apprentice, perhaps, or a colleague." They compiled a list of everyone associated with manuscript work who had been present at the fair. Besides Dr. Thornton and the late Benedict Walker, there was Mr. Graves from the British Library, whose expertise was in cataloguing rather than restoration. There were 2 other dealers specializing in manuscripts, both of whom had solid alibis for the crucial time period. And then there was Brother Simon. Inspector Slack's expression grew troubled. "The monk has the knowledge. He tends the monk's hood in the monastery garden, and he works with manuscripts daily. But what would be his motive?" Miss Marple had been considering this question. Brother Simon loved those manuscripts as much as any human being could love an inanimate object. When they were stolen and destroyed, or so he believed, it must have been devastating. Then he discovers they weren't destroyed at all, but were being sold for profit by Mr. Ashworth. "Revenge," the inspector said. "But we'd need proof." They brought Brother Simon in for questioning. The young monk looked exhausted, his face drawn with strain. He sat across from them in the interview room at the village hall, his hands folded calmly in his lap. "Brother Simon," Inspector Slack began, "we need to know where you were between 8:30 and 9:15 yesterday morning." "I was at morning prayers with the rest of the community," Brother Simon replied immediately. "We observe Lauds at that hour. It's one of our fixed times of communal worship. Can anyone verify that?" "The entire community can verify it." Brother Simon's voice held a note of steel beneath its usual gentleness. "We were 30 brothers in the chapel, including the abbot. We prayed together for 40 minutes, from 8 until 8:40. Inspector Slack consulted the timeline. That would have made it physically impossible for you to be in St. Mary Mead during the crucial period. The monastery is 20 miles away." "Exactly," Brother Simon said quietly. Miss Marple had been watching the young monk's face carefully. "Brother Simon, you mentioned that you loved your monastery's manuscripts. How did you feel when you believed they were destroyed?" The monk's composure wavered. "It was one of the darkest periods of my life. Those manuscripts were not just books to me, Miss Marple. They were prayers made visible, devotion transformed into beauty. The illuminations were created by brothers who had lived centuries before me, who had dedicated their lives to glorifying God through art. When I thought they were gone forever, I felt as if I had failed them, failed to protect what they had created. And when you saw them here, in Mr. Ashworth's possession, Miss Marple prompted gently. Brother Simon's eyes filled with tears. I felt rage, pure, sinful rage. I wanted to strike him down for what he'd done. I wanted him to suffer as we had suffered. She paused, then added softly, "But I did not act on those feelings. My vows restrained me, and my faith reminded me that vengeance belongs to God, not to man. Yet someone did take vengeance," Miss Marple said. "Someone who cared deeply about those manuscripts, and who had the knowledge to poison them in a way that would ensure Mr. Ashworth's death." Brother Simon met her gaze steadily. "Then you must look for someone whose love for those manuscripts matched mine, but whose restraint was less. And I can tell you this. Such a person would have to have known exactly when and how Mr. Ashworth would handle the manuscript. They would have planned this carefully, with full knowledge of his habits and schedule." "How would someone gain such knowledge?" Inspector Slack asked. Brother Simon considered this. They would have needed to observe Mr. Ashworth over time, to know his routines, his methods of presentation. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion, but of calculated retribution. After Brother Simon was returned to his monastery, verified by his abbot's testimony about the morning prayers, Miss Marple and Inspector Slack found themselves once again reviewing the evidence. "The figure in the footage is too tall to be Sister Agnes," the inspector noted, "and too short to be Brother Simon, even if he hadn't had an alibi. Dr. Thornton is the right height, but we've confirmed through multiple witnesses that she was nowhere near the village hall at that time." Miss Marple had been silent for several minutes, her knitting needles moving in that steady rhythm that always accompanied her deepest thinking. "Inspector, have we considered everyone who attended the fair? We've accounted for all the dealers, all the serious collectors, and all the local residents," Inspector Slack said, sounding frustrated. "What about Mr. Ashworth's assistant?" Miss Marple asked suddenly. "Miss Cordelia Price. You mentioned her earlier. Where was she during the crucial time period?" The inspector flipped through his notes rapidly. Miss Price claimed she was at the inn preparing materials for the auction, but he looked up sharply. "I don't believe we've verified that independently." "I think it might be worthwhile to speak with Miss Price," Miss Marple suggested. "After all, she would have had intimate knowledge of Mr. Ashworth's habits and schedule. She would have known exactly how he planned to present the manuscript." Within the hour, Miss Cordelia Price was located at a hotel in London, where she had returned after giving her initial statement. Inspector Slack arranged for her to be brought back to St. Mary Mead that evening. While they waited, Miss Marple made discreet inquiries among the inn staff and learned something very interesting indeed. Miss Price had not been at the inn preparing auction materials on the morning in question. She had left the inn at approximately 8:15, carrying what one maid described as a dark coat and a hat in a canvas bag, and had not returned until nearly 10 o'clock. When Miss Cordelia Price arrived at the village hall, she was a woman transformed from the efficient, rather colourless assistant Miss Marple remembered from the day of the fair. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and her hands trembled visibly. "Miss Price," Inspector Slack began, "we need you to account for your whereabouts yesterday morning between 8:15 and 10 o'clock." For a long moment, the woman said nothing. Then quietly, she began to speak. "I was at the village hall. I went through the side entrance. I opened Mr. Ashworth's display case, and I applied a aconitum extract to 3 pages of the manuscript, knowing he would handle them extensively during his presentations. The room fell silent except for the soft clicking of Miss Marple's knitting needles. "Why?" Inspector Slack asked finally. Miss Price's voice remained flat, emotionless. "Because Edmund Ashworth murdered my father." Chapter 5. The Assistant's Confession. Inspector Slack leaned forward, his notebook forgotten. "Your father." Miss Price nodded slowly. "My father was Benedict Walker." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Miss Marple's needles stilled momentarily before resuming their rhythm. "I thought Benedict Walker's next of kin had been notified," Inspector Slack said. "We were told he had a half-sister, Dr. Thornton." Patricia is my aunt, Miss Price said. My father's half-sister. My mother died when I was young, and I was raised partly by my father and partly by Aunt Patricia. She taught me everything about manuscripts, about medieval art, about the care and restoration of ancient documents. And your father taught you his craft, Miss Marple said quietly. Yes. Cordelia Price's expression softened slightly. He was brilliant, you know, truly gifted. He could repair damage that other restorers declared hopeless. He could match inks and pigments so precisely that even experts couldn't detect his work. It was an art form for him. Inspector Slack's voice was firm. Miss Price, you need to understand that anything you say now may be used as evidence. I understand. The woman's voice remained steady. I want to tell you everything. I'm tired of carrying this alone. She drew a deep breath and continued. 5 years ago, my father met Edmund Ashworth. At first, it seemed like a wonderful opportunity. Mr. Ashworth had connections throughout the rare book world, and he began referring clients to my father. The work was legitimate then, or so I believed. When did that change? Miss Marple asked. About 3 years ago. Miss Price's hands twisted together in her lap. Mr. Ashworth approached my father with what he called a business proposition. He knew of collections that were poorly guarded, manuscripts that could be stolen or their valuable pages removed and replaced with forgeries. My father would do the actual restoration work, creating new manuscripts around the stolen pages or making perfect copies of the originals to hide the theft. In return, they would split the profits from selling the genuine articles. Did your father agree? Inspector Slack asked. He did. Miss Price's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. To my eternal shame, he did, and I helped him. You knew about the scheme, not at first, but eventually I discovered what they were doing. I confronted my father about it. We had a terrible argument. He tried to justify it, said these manuscripts were locked away where no one could appreciate them, that they deserved to be seen and valued. But I knew it was just rationalization. He was doing it for the money and the thrill of pulling off such an elaborate deception. What happened after your confrontation? Miss Price's eyes filled with tears. He promised me he would stop. He said he'd do one more job for Mr. Ashworth, the St. Benedict Commission, and then he'd end the partnership. But I could tell he was frightened. He'd become entangled with something dangerous, and he couldn't see a clean way out. The St. Benedict job was the Christmas gospel, Miss Marple said. Yes. The beautiful illuminated manuscript that was supposed to have been destroyed in a fire my father set deliberately. He removed the most valuable pages, replaced them with forgeries that he then burned to create authentic-looking ashes, and delivered the stolen illuminations to Mr. Ashworth. It was their most ambitious theft yet. And then your father died, Inspector Slack said quietly. Cordelia Price wiped her eyes. He was found in the Thames 3 weeks ago. The police called it an accident, a drunken fall. But as I told you, my father didn't drink. He was terrified in the days before his death. He kept saying Mr. Ashworth wanted him to do another job, something he didn't want to do. He said he was going to go to the authorities, confess everything, and try to return what they'd stolen. But he never got the chance, Miss Marple said. No, Miss Price's voice hardened. I believe Mr. Ashworth killed him to keep him silent. My father knew too much, and once he started talking about going to the police, he became a liability. Inspector Slack made careful notes. Can you prove any of this? I can prove my father's involvement in the thefts. Miss Price reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. He kept meticulous records. Every manuscript they stole or altered, every forgery he created, every payment Mr. Ashworth made to him. It's all here, along with photographs showing the process. Why didn't you go to the police with this immediately? The inspector asked. Because I wanted justice, not just for the thefts, but for my father's murder. Miss Price met his gaze directly. The police had ruled his death an accident. Without proof that Mr. Ashworth killed him, he would only face charges for the manuscript thefts. He might have spent a few years in prison, but he would have lived. That wasn't enough. So you decided to kill him yourself. Inspector Slack's voice was without judgment, merely stating fact. Yes. Cordelia Price showed no signs of remorse. I planned it carefully. I knew Mr. Ashworth would be displaying the St. Benedict manuscript at this fair. He'd been boasting about it for weeks, how it would be his crowning achievement, how he'd auction it for a record price. I applied for the position as his assistant 6 months ago, using a false name and credentials that my aunt helped me create. Aunt Patricia didn't know what I was planning. She thought I just wanted to gather evidence against him. You gained his trust, Miss Marple said. Completely. I was efficient, discreet, and showed the proper reverence for his precious manuscripts. He never suspected that I was Benedict Walker's daughter. I changed my appearance, used my mother's maiden name, and he never made the connection. And the poison? Inspector Slack asked. How did you acquire it? Miss Price's expression remained calm. My father taught me about medieval manuscripts, which included knowledge of the toxic substances sometimes used in their creation. Cinnabar, white lead, arsenic-based pigments. He warned me about handling old manuscripts safely. I researched monkshood specifically because it's mentioned in medieval herbals. I knew St. Benedict's monastery grew it in their historical garden. It wasn't difficult to collect it from the wild in places where it grows naturally. I dried it, extracted the alkaloid, and created a solution that could be applied to vellum. You tested it first, Miss Marple said, a statement rather than a question. Yes, Miss Price acknowledged. On samples of medieval vellum I purchased from a supply house. I needed to ensure it would be absorbed by the material without damaging the illuminations, and that it would remain potent enough to be lethal. This level of premeditation. Inspector Slack began, then stopped, shaking his head. I knew exactly what I was doing, Miss Price said firmly. I arrived in St. Mary Mead the evening before the fair as Mr. Ashworth's assistant. I helped him set up his display, watched him lock the manuscript in its case. I memorized his routine, how he would present it, which pages he would touch most frequently. Then, early the next morning, I returned to the village hall alone. The security footage shows you entering at 8:50, Inspector Slack said. You knew where the cameras were positioned. Mr. Ashworth had complained about them, said they were intrusive. I knew exactly how to avoid showing my face. I applied the poison to 3 specific pages, the ones I knew he would handle most during his presentations. The Annunciation, the Adoration, and the Flight into Egypt. The most beautiful illuminations from the St. Benedict Gospel. It seemed fitting, somehow, that the treasures he'd stolen would become the instruments of his death. And then you simply waited, Miss Marple said quietly. I returned to the inn, changed back into my normal clothes, and came to the fair when it opened officially. I watched him give his first presentation, watched him touch those pages with his bare hands when he adjusted the manuscript before the presentation began. I knew it was just a matter of time. Did you feel any remorse? Inspector Slack asked, when you saw him dying. Cordelia Price considered the question. No, not then, not now. He murdered my father. He stole sacred treasures from monasteries and churches. He built his reputation and wealth on lies and theft. He deserved what happened to him. Miss Marple's needles had continued their steady rhythm throughout the confession. Now she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. Miss Price, what you've described is murder, carefully planned and executed. Whatever Mr. Ashworth's crimes, you had no right to take his life. Justice exists for a reason. The woman turned to look at her, and for the first time a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Where was justice for my father? Where was justice for all the institutions Mr. Ashworth robbed? The legal system would have given him a slap on the wrist. This way, at least there's true accounting. Inspector Slack rose from his chair. Cordelia Price, I'm arresting you for the murder of Edmund Ashworth. He proceeded with the formal caution while Miss Price sat unmoving, her face once again composed and calm. As they led her away, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting in her lap. Dr. Thornton, who had been allowed to observe the questioning, approached her. Thank you, the manuscript expert said quietly, for finding the truth. My brother made terrible choices, but he didn't deserve to be murdered. And knowing that Cordelia has confessed helps me understand his last days, why he was so frightened. She sat beside Miss Marple, both women watching through the window as Cordelia Price was placed in the police car. I taught her everything I knew about manuscripts, Dr. Thornton continued, her voice heavy with regret. I wanted to share my passion, to train someone who would carry on the work of preserving these treasures. I never imagined she would use that knowledge to kill. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She loved her father deeply. In her mind, she was carrying out justice, not murder. It's a tragedy all around. What will happen to the manuscript now? Dr. Thornton asked. The St. Benedict Gospel pages. Miss Marple smiled slightly. I imagine they'll be returned to the monastery where they belong. Brother Simon will see to their proper care, and perhaps some good can come from all this sorrow. That evening, as the winter sun set early over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her cottage reflecting on the case. The threads of the mystery, once tangled and confusing, had finally been woven into a clear pattern, a pattern of greed, theft, murder, and vengeance. She thought about Cordelia Price, a young woman who had lost her father and sought retribution in the most final way possible. She thought about Benedict Walker, a talented restorer who had allowed greed to corrupt his gifts. She thought about Edmund Ashworth, whose pursuit of profit had led him to steal sacred treasures, and ultimately to murder when his accomplice threatened to confess. And she thought about the manuscripts themselves, those beautiful illuminations created centuries ago by devout monks who had sought to glorify their faith through art. They had survived wars, fires, and the passage of centuries, only to become instruments of death in the modern world. Her telephone rang, interrupting her musings. It was Reverend Leonard. Miss Marple, I wanted you to know. The abbot has invited our parish to attend a special service at St. Benedict's Monastery next month. They're going to restore and rebind the Gospel pages properly, and they want to give thanks for their return. He thought you might like to attend, given your role in solving the case. I would be honoured, Miss Marple replied. It will be good to see those illuminations where they belong. After she hung up, she returned to her knitting, the needles moving in their familiar rhythm. The pattern she was creating was a complex one, requiring attention and skill. Much like solving a murder, she reflected. One had to be patient, follow the threads carefully, and trust that eventually the design would reveal itself. Outside her window, St. Mary Mead settled into its evening routine. Lights came on in cottages, chimneys sent up threads of smoke, and the village returned to its usual peaceful state. The excitement of the murder investigation would fade, becoming just another story in the long history of the community. But Miss Marple knew that for those directly touched by the tragedy, Dr. Thornton, Sister Agnes, Brother Simon, and especially Cordelia Price, the effects would linger far longer. Lives had been changed, some irreparably, and all because of greed, vengeance, and the deadly misuse of beauty. She thought of the medieval monks who had created those illuminations so long ago. They had worked with paints that sometimes contained toxic substances, carefully protecting themselves while creating beauty that would endure for centuries. They had understood that even beautiful things could be dangerous if mishandled. It was a lesson, Miss Marple reflected, that Cordelia Price had learned in the worst possible way. Chapter 6. The Monastery Gathering. 3 weeks after Cordelia Price's arrest, Miss Marple found herself travelling through the crisp December countryside toward the monastery of St. Benedict. Reverend Leonard drove, keeping up a cheerful commentary about the landscape, while Miss Marple gazed out the window, her thoughts on the case that had been concluded, but not entirely resolved in her mind. The monastery appeared as they crested a hill, its ancient stone walls glowing golden in the afternoon sun. It was a beautiful sight, timeless and serene, exactly the sort of place that would treasure illuminated manuscripts as sacred objects, rather than mere commodities. Abbot Thomas greeted them at the gate personally, his weathered face creased in a welcoming smile. Miss Marple, Reverend Leonard, welcome to St. Benedict's. We're grateful you could join us for this special occasion. He led them through the monastery grounds, pointing out the medicinal garden where Brother Simon cultivated his herbs with such care. The monkshood plants were there, their deadly beauty carefully tended and labelled with warnings. Brother Simon approached, looking more at peace than he had during the investigation. Miss Marple, thank you for coming. I wanted to show you something. He guided her to the monastery library, a magnificent room with vaulted ceilings and walls lined with centuries-old books. In the centre, on a special stand, lay the restored Christmas Gospel. The stolen pages had been returned and properly rebound with the remaining portions of the manuscript. The illuminations glowed with their original splendour, the gold leaf catching the light just as it had when first applied 8 centuries earlier. "It's beautiful," Miss Marple breathed, genuinely moved. "We held a service of thanksgiving this morning," Brother Simon said softly, "not just for the return of the manuscript, but for the lives touched by this tragedy. We prayed for Mr. Ashworth, for Benedict Walker, and for Cordelia Price. They all made terrible choices, but they were all God's children. That's very generous." Miss Marple replied, "It's necessary," the monk said simply. "Hatred and vengeance led to murder. Only forgiveness can prevent the cycle from continuing." Later, during tea in the monastery's guest house, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Dr. Patricia Thornton. The manuscript expert looked tired, but somehow lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. "Cordelia has agreed to cooperate fully with the authorities," Dr. Thornton said. "She's provided all of my brother's records, which has helped the police trace dozens of stolen manuscripts. Several institutions have already recovered their stolen property." "That's something positive from all this tragedy," Miss Marple said. Dr. Thornton nodded. "She's also agreed to testify about Mr. Ashworth's involvement in Ben's death. The police have found evidence in Ashworth's files that corroborates her belief that he murdered my brother. There's a paper trail of threatening messages, surveillance records. It won't bring Ben back, but at least the truth is known. How is Cordelia bearing up?" The expert's expression turned sad. "She's resigned to whatever punishment comes. In a strange way, I think she's relieved. She carried such rage for so long. Now that she's acted on it, she's empty. She doesn't seem to understand yet that what she did was wrong, not just legally but morally. She genuinely believed she was executing justice." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "That's often the way with those who take justice into their own hands. They convince themselves that the ends justify the means, but murder is never justified, no matter the provocation." Inspector Slack arrived later in the afternoon, accepting the abbot's invitation to attend the evening service. He sought out Miss Marple before the service began. "I thought you'd like to know, Miss Marple. The case is essentially closed. We've recovered evidence that strongly suggests Mr. Ashworth was responsible for Benedict Walker's death. He lured Walker to the Thames riverbank under the pretense of a meeting, then pushed him in. A witness has come forward who saw 2 men arguing near the water that night. The description matches Ashworth and Walker. So Cordelia's suspicions were correct," Miss Marple said. "Yes, which complicates her case somewhat. Her defence attorney is arguing that she was acting in response to her father's murder, that there was a degree of emotional justification." The inspector shook his head. "I don't envy the jury that has to decide her fate." "What about the other victims of the manuscript theft ring?" Miss Marple asked. "How many institutions were affected?" Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "At least 15 that we've identified so far, spanning 3 countries. Ashworth and Walker had been operating for nearly 5 years. The total value of stolen manuscripts and pages runs into the millions. Many have been recovered now, thanks to Cordelia's documentation, but some are still missing, probably sold to private collectors who have no idea. They're holding stolen property. And Mr. Graves, what's his status? The curator from the British Library has been cleared of any wrongdoing. He genuinely didn't know what Walker was doing with the institutions he recommended him to. He's been rather shaken by the whole affair, understandably. Feels guilty for inadvertently facilitating the thefts." The evening service was held in the monastery chapel, a solemn and beautiful ceremony that combined thanksgiving for the manuscript's return with prayers for all those affected by the tragedy. Miss Marple sat beside Reverend Leonard, listening to the ancient chants and reflecting on the strange ways that human lives intersected. After the service, Abbot Thomas invited a small group to view the restored manuscript one final time before it was secured in the monastery's vault. Miss Marple stood before it, studying the intricate illuminations that had been the catalyst for so much pain. The Annunciation to the shepherds showed angels descending from a golden sky, their faces radiant with joy. The Adoration of the Magi depicted the 3 kings offering their gifts to the infant Christ, their robes rich with colour and detail. The flight into Egypt showed Mary holding Jesus tenderly as Joseph led the donkey along a path bordered with flowers and small animals, including the distinctive rabbit that Brother Simon had mentioned. "They're remarkably beautiful," Miss Marple said to the abbot. "I can understand why people would be tempted to steal them." Abbot Thomas nodded gravely. Beauty can be dangerous when divorced from its proper context and purpose. These illuminations were created as acts of devotion, meant to glorify God and help worshippers in prayer. When they become mere commodities to be bought and sold, their true purpose is corrupted. And sometimes that corruption leads to violence, Miss Marple added quietly. As they were preparing to leave, Sister Agnes approached Miss Marple. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "When Mr. Ashworth died and suspicion fell on me, I was terrified. You helped reveal the truth, and for that I'm grateful." "I'm glad it's resolved," Miss Marple replied, "and I'm glad your monastery's treasures have been returned." Sister Agnes glanced back at the manuscript. They were always more than just beautiful objects to us. Their prayers made visible, faith transformed into art. Every time I look at them, I remember the monks who created them, how they mixed their pigments and applied each brushstroke as an act of worship. That's what Mr. Ashworth and my father's murderer never understood. They saw monetary value instead of spiritual worth. "That's a profound observation," Miss Marple said gently. "And perhaps that's the real tragedy of this case. So many people saw these manuscripts as things to be possessed or used for their own purposes, rather than as sacred treasures to be honoured and preserved." On the drive back to St. Mary Mead, Reverend Leonard was unusually quiet. Finally, as they approached the village, he spoke. "I keep thinking about Cordelia Price. She was so certain she was doing the right thing, executing justice for her father's murder. How does someone become so convinced that murder is justified?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "I think it happens gradually. First, she lost her mother, which left her with an intense attachment to her father. Then she discovered his involvement in the thefts and felt betrayed but also protective. When he died, murdered by his partner in crime, her grief transformed into rage. She channeled that rage into a plan for revenge, and somewhere along the way she stopped seeing Mr. Ashworth as a human being and saw him only as someone who needed to be eliminated. But she was intelligent, educated, skilled in her field. Surely she must have known it was wrong. Intellectually, perhaps." Miss Marple agreed, but emotionally she had convinced herself otherwise. "That's the danger of vengeance, Reverend. It clouds our judgment and allows us to rationalize even the most terrible actions." The vicar was silent for a moment, then said, "I find myself feeling sorry for her, despite what she did." "As do I," Miss Marple admitted. "Her father made terrible choices that ultimately cost him his life. Then she compounded those choices by taking another life in response. It's a tragedy of errors and missed chances for redemption. Will she face the death penalty?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, murder by poison is still murder, but with the evidence about Mr. Ashworth killing her father, she'll likely receive life imprisonment rather than execution. She'll have many years to contemplate her choices." As they pulled up to Miss Marple's cottage, the familiar sight of her garden and her cosy home was a welcome return to normalcy. She thanked Reverend Leonard for the ride and made her way inside, where her housekeeper had left the fire burning and tea prepared. She settled into her favourite chair with her knitting, reflecting on the events of the past month. The case had been solved, the manuscripts returned, and justice, of a sort, would be served. Yet she couldn't help but feel a lingering sadness for all the wasted potential and broken lives. Cordelia Price had been a talented young woman with a promising future. Benedict Walker had been a skilled restorer. Even Edmund Ashworth, for all his greed and criminality, had possessed knowledge and expertise in his field. All of them had allowed darker impulses to corrupt their gifts, and the result had been death and destruction. The Christmas season was approaching, the season celebrated in those beautiful illuminations that had caused so much tragedy. Miss Marple thought about the original purpose of those images, to remind viewers of hope, redemption, and divine love. How ironic that they had instead become instruments of death. Her telephone rang, interrupting her reflections. It was Inspector Slack. Miss Marple, I thought you'd want to know. Cordelia. Price has been formally charged with murder. The trial is set for spring. Her attorney is building a defence around diminished capacity due to grief and her father's murder. But between you and me, I don't think it will succeed. The premeditation was too clear, the planning too detailed. I suspected as much, Miss Marple said. How is she? Resigned, the inspector replied. She asked me to thank you, actually. Said you treated her with respect even when you knew what she'd done. She wanted you to know she doesn't regret killing Ashworth, but she does regret the pain she's caused to others, especially her aunt. That's something at least, Miss Marple said softly. After the call ended, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The pattern she was working on was nearly complete, a complex design that had required patience and skill. Like the manuscript illuminations, it required attention to detail and an understanding that each stitch contributed to the whole. She thought about the various people involved in the case. Brother Simon, who had channeled his love for manuscripts into constructive preservation rather than destructive vengeance. Sister Agnes, who had pursued truth rather than retribution. Dr. Thornton, who had lost both her brother and niece to the corruption of greed and revenge, but continued her work with dignity and purpose. And she thought about Cordelia Price, who would spend the rest of her life imprisoned not just by walls, but by the consequences of her choice to take justice into her own hands. Outside her window, St. Mary Mead twinkled with early Christmas lights. The village was preparing for the holiday season, decorating trees and shops, planning services and celebrations. Life continued its normal rhythm, largely unmarked by the tragedy that had briefly disrupted its peace. Miss Marple finished the row she was working on and set her knitting aside. She would visit Cordelia Price before the trial, she decided. Not to condone what the young woman had done, but to offer some measure of compassion. After all, Cordelia would face a lifetime of consequences for her actions. The least Miss Marple could do was remind her that she was still a human being worthy of dignity, if not absolution. As she prepared for bed that night, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of justice and vengeance. The law would punish Cordelia for her crime, just as it would have punished Edmund Ashworth had he lived. But the deeper questions, about morality, about the corruption of talent and purpose, about the price of revenge, those would linger far longer than any legal proceedings. She thought of the Christmas Gospel, safely returned to its monastery home, its illuminations glowing with the same beauty they had possessed for 8 centuries. Those monks who had created them so long ago had understood something that their modern counterparts had forgotten, that true beauty served a higher purpose than mere possession or profit. It was meant to elevate the spirit, to remind viewers of truths that transcended the material world. In seeking to possess and profit from that beauty, Edmund Ashworth had corrupted its purpose. In seeking to punish him for that corruption, Cordelia Price had committed an even greater corruption. And in the end, the only ones who had truly honoured the manuscripts were those who sought to preserve and protect them for others. Miss Marple's last thought before sleep claimed her was of Brother Simon in his monastery garden, tending his plants with care and reverence, understanding that even the most deadly things could be beautiful, and even the most beautiful things could be deadly if misused. It was a lesson worth remembering. Chapter 7. The Trial and Resolution. Spring came early to St. Mary Mead, bringing with it the trial of Cordelia Price. Miss Marple had followed the case through newspaper reports and conversations with Inspector Slack, and when she received a summons to testify as a witness, she was not surprised. The courthouse in the county seat was filled to capacity on the first day of the trial. The case had attracted considerable attention, not just for the murder itself, but for the complex web of manuscript theft and fraud that had been revealed in its wake. Miss Marple arrived early and found herself seated in the waiting room with other witnesses. Dr. Patricia Thornton was there, looking drawn but composed. Brother Simon sat quietly in a corner, his hands folded in prayer. Sister Agnes paced nervously, and Mr. Graves from the British Library reviewed his notes with intense concentration. The trial proceeded with methodical efficiency. The prosecution laid out its case clearly. Cordelia Price had deliberately and with premeditation murdered Edmund Ashworth by applying contact poison to manuscript pages she knew he would handle. The evidence was overwhelming. The security footage, the confession, the detailed planning documents found in her possession. When Miss Marple was called to testify, she answered the questions put to her honestly but without elaboration. She described the day of the murder, her observations of the fair, and her eventual realization about the poisoned manuscript. Under cross-examination by Cordelia's defense attorney, she acknowledged that the defendant's father had indeed been murdered by Edmund Ashworth. Did Miss Price have reason to believe her father's death would go unpunished? The defense attorney asked. The police had ruled it an accident, Miss Marple replied carefully. Whether that gave her reason to take matters into her own hands is another question entirely. The defense strategy became clear as the trial progressed. They were arguing that Cordelia had been driven to temporary insanity by grief over her father's murder, that her actions, while criminal, were not the result of a sound mind. Psychiatric experts testified about the effects of grief and trauma. Character witnesses described Cordelia as a devoted daughter who had been psychologically shattered by her father's death. The prosecution countered with evidence of the extensive planning involved. Cordelia had spent months infiltrating Ashworth's organization, researching poisons, and preparing her murder weapon. This was not the act of someone who had suddenly snapped under pressure, but of someone who had carefully calculated every step. Dr. Thornton's testimony was particularly affecting. She spoke of her niece's brilliance, her dedication to manuscript preservation, and the close relationship she had shared with her father. But she also acknowledged Cordelia's single-minded determination once she had fixated on avenging Benedict Walker's death. She loved her father deeply. Dr. Thornton said, her voice breaking slightly, "When he died, something in her broke. I should have seen it, should have gotten her help. But she hid it so well, channeled all that grief and rage into her plan for revenge." Brother Simon's testimony focused on the manuscripts themselves and the devastating effect of their theft on the monastery community. He spoke with quiet dignity about the violation of sacred trust and the pain of believing their treasures had been destroyed. But even in the midst of explaining what had been lost, he added, "We never wished death upon Mr. Ashworth. We wanted justice, yes, but not this kind of justice. What Miss Price did was not redemptive. It only added more tragedy to an already tragic situation." The turning point in the trial came when Cordelia herself took the stand. Against her attorney's advice, she insisted on testifying. She spoke calmly and articulately about her father's work, his involvement with Ashworth, and his eventual murder. "I knew the police wouldn't investigate properly," she said. "They'd already closed the case as an accidental drowning. No one cared that a book restorer had died. He wasn't important enough. So I decided to find the truth myself, and to ensure that the man who killed him would pay for it." The prosecutor pressed her on the premeditation. "You spent months planning this murder." "Yes." Cordelia showed no remorse. "I wanted to be certain. I didn't want to risk failure. My father deserved justice, and I was going to give it to him. Did it never occur to you that what you were planning was itself murder, that you were becoming the same kind of person as Mr. Ashworth?" Cordelia's expression hardened. "It wasn't the same at all. Mr. Ashworth killed my father to protect his criminal enterprise. I killed Mr. Ashworth to punish him for that crime. One was motivated by greed, the other by love." The prosecutor's voice was gentle but firm, but both resulted in death. Both were deliberate takings of human life. How are they different in the eyes of the law or morality? For the first time, Cordelia seemed uncertain. She looked at her aunt, who was weeping quietly in the gallery. Then she looked at Miss Marple, who met her gaze with compassion but also with unwavering honesty. "I don't know," Cordelia finally said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Maybe they're not different. Maybe I became what I hated. But I can't undo it now." The closing arguments were powerful on both sides. The defense pleaded for understanding, painting Cordelia as a victim of circumstances who had been pushed beyond her capacity to cope. The prosecution acknowledged the tragedy of her situation, but insisted that premeditated murder could not be excused, regardless of provocation. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, their verdict was guilty of first-degree murder, but with a recommendation for mercy due to the mitigating circumstances of her father's death. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, took her time with the sentencing. She acknowledged the complexity of the case, the genuine grief Cordelia had experienced, and the moral ambiguity of punishing someone who had sought to redress what the legal system had failed to address. But in the end, she concluded, the law was clear. Miss Price, you took a human life deliberately and with premeditation. Whatever Mr. Ashworth's crimes, and they were substantial, he deserved to face justice through proper legal channels, not through vigilante execution. I sentence you to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. I hope that during your incarceration, you will find a way to understand the full weight of what you have done and to seek genuine redemption. Cordelia Price received the sentence without visible emotion. As the bailiffs led her away, she looked back once at her aunt, mouthing the words, "I'm sorry." Dr. Thornton dissolved into tears, comforted by Sister Agnes and Miss Marple. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamoured for statements. Inspector Slack provided a brief official comment about justice being served. The monastery delegation declined to speak to the media, instead retreating to their vehicle for the long drive home. Miss Marple found herself walking with Dr. Thornton toward the car park. The manuscript expert was composed now, though her eyes were red and swollen. "Thank you for being here," Dr. Thornton said. "It meant a great deal to have friendly faces in the courtroom." "I'm only sorry that the outcome was so painful," Miss Marple replied. "But I believe the judge was as merciful as the law allowed. 25 years. Dr. Thornton shook her head. "She'll be nearly 50 when she's eligible for parole, if she even gets it. Her life, her career, everything is gone. She made choices that led to this." Miss Marple said gently but firmly. "Tragic choices, perhaps, but choices nonetheless. We cannot escape the consequences of our actions, no matter how justified we believe them to be." Dr. Thornton nodded slowly. "I know. I just wish she had trusted the system, trusted that truth would eventually come out. We had the evidence about Ashworth and Ben. If she had just been patient." But patience was not something she possessed at that moment, Miss Marple said. Grief had consumed her, and grief is not always rational. They reached Dr. Thornton's car. The manuscript expert paused before getting in. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Back to your quiet village life?" Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Yes, back to St. Mary Mead, back to my garden and my knitting and my observations of human nature. Though I must say, this case has reinforced my belief that human nature is endlessly complex, and often quite surprising." "You solved the murder within days," Dr. Thornton observed. "You saw patterns that professional investigators missed." "I simply paid attention," Miss Marple said modestly. "And I've learned over the years that people are remarkably consistent in their behaviours. Once you understand what motivates them, their actions become predictable." "What motivated Cordelia, in your view?" Dr. Thornton asked. "Love," Miss Marple replied without hesitation. Fierce, all-consuming love for her father, combined with grief at his loss and rage at his murder. Those are powerful emotions, and when they're not properly channeled or addressed, they can lead to terrible actions. Dr. Thornton was silent for a moment, then said, "I'll visit her, you know, regularly. She's still my niece, and I still love her, despite everything." "That's good," Miss Marple said warmly. "She'll need that connection to the outside world, to remind her that she's more than her worst action." As Miss Marple made her way back to St. Mary Mead that evening, she reflected on the trial and its outcome. Justice had been served in the legal sense. Cordelia Price would spend the next quarter-century in prison for taking Edmund Ashworth's life. But the deeper questions remained unanswered. Had justice truly been served? Was the punishment proportionate to the crime, given the provocation? And what of Ashworth's murder of Benedict Walker? Would that crime have ever been prosecuted if Cordelia hadn't forced it into the open? These were questions without easy answers, and Miss Marple knew better than to pretend otherwise. The world was not black and white, but rather shades of grey, with moral ambiguity lurking in even the most seemingly straightforward situations. She thought of the Christmas Gospel, safely returned to St. Benedict's monastery. At least that had a happy ending. The beautiful illuminations would continue to inspire and uplift viewers for generations to come, return to their proper purpose after their brief and tragic stint as murder weapons. When she arrived home, her housekeeper had prepared dinner and left a note saying that Reverend Leonard had called to check on her. Miss Marple telephoned him back, assuring him that she was fine and that the trial had concluded as expected. A sad business all around, the vicar said. But at least it's resolved now. Is it? Miss Marple mused. The legal proceedings are concluded, certainly, but the ripples from this tragedy will continue for years. Dr. Thornton has lost both her brother and her niece. The monastery. Community must live with the knowledge that their sacred treasures were stolen and used in a murder, and Cordelia Price has decades of imprisonment ahead of her to contemplate her choices. That's a rather grim view, Reverend Leonard observed. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, but it's realistic. Our actions have consequences that extend far beyond ourselves. Cordelia chose vengeance over justice, and now she must live with that choice for the rest of her life. Do you think she'll find redemption? The vicar asked. Miss Marple considered the question. I hope so. 25 years is a long time. She's young enough to potentially rebuild her life after prison, if she's granted parole. But first, she must come to truly understand and regret what she's done. That kind of genuine remorse and transformation is possible, but it requires honesty, humility, and grace. I shall pray for her, Reverend Leonard said simply, as should we all. Miss Marple agreed. After she hung up, Miss Marple prepared for bed, following her usual evening routine. But before she retired, she spent a few minutes in her sitting room, looking at a small photograph she had kept from the trial. It showed the restored Christmas gospel, the illuminations glowing with their centuries-old beauty. Those medieval monks, she thought, had understood something profound. They had created beauty as an offering, not for personal gain or glory, but as an expression of devotion. They had used their talents in service of something greater than themselves. How different from the modern players in this tragedy, all of whom had sought to possess, profit from, or use those same illuminations for their own purposes. Ashworth had seen monetary value. Walker had seen an opportunity for wealth. Cordelia had seen a means of revenge. Only the monastery community had seen the manuscripts for what they truly were, sacred objects worthy of reverence and protection. Miss Marple returned the photograph to its place and made her way upstairs. Tomorrow would bring a return to normal life in St. Mary Mead, to the small dramas and minor mysteries that characterized village existence. But she would not forget this case or its lessons about the corruption of beauty, the danger of vengeance, and the far-reaching consequences of our choices. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of Cordelia Price, beginning her long journey through the prison system, carrying the weight of her crime, and perhaps, someday, finding a path toward genuine redemption. The case of the Christmas manuscript murder was closed, but its echoes would resonate for years to come. Chapter 8. The Prisoner's Letters. 6 months after the trial, Miss Marple received an unexpected letter. It bore the return address of the Women's Correctional Facility, where Cordelia Price was serving her sentence. Miss Marple set down her tea and opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat and precise, much like Cordelia herself had been during the investigation. Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you well. I realize you may find it strange to hear from me, but Dr. Thornton mentioned during her last visit that you had expressed concern for my welfare. I wanted to write and thank you for your kindness during the investigation and trial. Prison is a difficult adjustment, as you might imagine. I have a great deal of time to think about what I did and why I did it. The other inmates know I'm here for murder, but most don't know the details. I've found work in the prison library which provides some comfort. Being surrounded by books even here reminds me of who I once was. I've been attending counselling sessions as required, and the therapist keeps asking me if I regret what I did. I find it difficult to answer honestly. I don't regret that Mr. Ashworth is dead. He murdered my father and deserved punishment. But I do regret the pain I've caused others, my aunt especially. She visits every month without fail, though I can see the toll this has taken on her. The chaplain here speaks often about forgiveness and redemption. I listen, but I'm not certain I understand. How does one find redemption for taking a life? How does one forgive oneself? If you have any wisdom to offer, I would welcome it. You struck me as someone who understands human nature deeply and without judgment. Yours respectfully, Cordelia Price. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then set it aside and considered her response. That evening she sat at her writing desk and composed a reply. Dear Cordelia, thank you for your letter. I am pleased to hear that you found some purpose in the prison library. Books have a way of providing solace even in the darkest times. You ask about redemption and forgiveness, and these are not simple questions to answer. I am not a theologian or a philosopher, merely an old woman who has observed human nature for many years. But I can share what I've learned. Redemption, I believe, begins with honest acknowledgement of what one has done wrong. Not justification, not rationalization, but simple, clear-eyed recognition of the harm caused. You say you don't regret Mr. Ashworth's death, only the pain caused to others. But until you can see that taking his life was wrong in itself, regardless of his crimes, true redemption will elude you. Mr. Ashworth was a thief and a murderer, this is true. But he was also a human being, flawed and corrupt perhaps, but still worthy of life and the possibility of facing justice through proper channels. When you killed him, you didn't just end his life. You appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner. You took on a role that no human being has the right to claim. Forgiveness, self-forgiveness especially, comes after this recognition. It requires not just regret for consequences, but genuine remorse for the action itself. Only then can healing begin. You have many years ahead of you, Cordelia. Use them wisely. Learn, grow, and perhaps someday you will understand that justice and vengeance are not the same thing, no matter how we try to justify our actions. I wish you well in your journey. Sincerely, Jane Marple. The correspondence continued over the following months. Cordelia's letters gradually shifted in tone, becoming more reflective and less defensive. She wrote about her work in the library, about the books she was reading, and about the slow, painful process of examining her choices. 3 months after their first exchange, Cordelia wrote, Dear Miss Marple, you were right about everything. I've been reading books on ethics and morality, trying to understand where I went so wrong. I think I convinced myself that because my cause was just, avenging my father's murder, my methods were justified. But they weren't. I took a human life with premeditation and planning. I didn't just want Mr. Ashworth dead. I wanted him to suffer, to know what it felt like to be helpless and dying. That realization horrifies me now. What kind of person thinks that way? The chaplain says I need to forgive myself before I can move forward. But how can I forgive myself when I can't undo what I've done? Mr. Ashworth's family, he had a sister who wrote me a letter full of grief and anger, will never forgive me. Why should I forgive myself? Miss Marple replied, Dear Cordelia, your question about self-forgiveness is one that many struggle with. The answer, I think, lies in understanding that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing. It means accepting the reality of what happened, taking full responsibility for it, and choosing to move forward in a different way. Mr. Ashworth's sister has every right to her grief and anger. You took her brother from her, regardless of his crimes. But her forgiveness is not required for your redemption. That must come from within, from a genuine change of heart and mind. You ask what kind of person thinks the way you did. The answer is, a person consumed by grief and rage, a person who allowed those emotions to corrupt their judgment and values. But you are not defined solely by your worst action. You have the capacity to become someone different, someone who understands the value of all human life and the importance of justice over vengeance. This transformation will not happen quickly or easily. It will take years of honest self-examination and the willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths about yourself. But it is possible if you're willing to do the work. Throughout this exchange, Miss Marple kept Dr. Thornton informed. The manuscript expert was grateful for Miss Marple's involvement. She's changing, Dr. Thornton said during one of her visits to St. Mary Mead. I can see it in her face when I visit. She's still deeply troubled, but there's a softness now that wasn't there before. She actually cried during our last visit when talking about Mr. Ashworth's family. "That's progress," Miss Marple said. "Genuine remorse must include empathy for the victim and their loved ones. Do you think she'll ever be truly free, even if she gets parole someday?" Miss Marple considered this. She'll carry this with her for the rest of her life, but that burden can be transformative rather than merely destructive, if she allows it to be. Some people who have committed terrible acts become the strongest advocates for justice and reconciliation precisely because they understand both sides of the equation. As the months turned into a year, Cordelia's letters reflected deeper transformation. She had completed several educational programs in prison and was helping other inmates with literacy. She had also begun corresponding with restorative justice programs, exploring ways to make amends beyond simply serving her sentence. One letter in particular stood out. "Dear Miss Marple, something happened yesterday that I need to tell you about. I was working in the library when one of the inmates, a woman named Sarah, asked me why I was in prison. I usually avoid that question, but something made me answer honestly this time. I told her I had murdered someone because he killed my father. I expected judgment or fear, but instead, she told me her story. She killed her abusive husband after years of torment. She said she understood the desire for vengeance, the feeling that the system wouldn't protect her, so she had to act. We talked for hours, and for the first time, I found myself not justifying what I did, but acknowledging that it was wrong, even with the provocation. I told her that if I could go back, I would choose differently. I would have gone to the police with all my father's evidence, would have trusted the system to work eventually. She asked if I meant it, and I realized I did. For the first time, I genuinely wished I had made different choices, not just because of the consequences to me, but because taking a life is fundamentally wrong, no matter the circumstances. Is this what redemption feels like? This aching regret combined with a determination to be different, to help others avoid my mistakes. Miss Marple shared this letter with Reverend Leonard during one of their regular tea visits. "She's finally understanding," the vicar said, clearly moved. "True remorse isn't just regretting consequences, it's recognizing the moral wrong of the action itself." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "And that's the first real step toward redemption. She has a long road ahead, but at least she's on the right path now." The correspondence continued, becoming less frequent as Cordelia became more engaged with prison life and various programs, but the letters that did come showed consistent growth and deepening understanding. 2 years after the trial, Cordelia wrote, "Dear Miss Marple, I wanted you to know that I've been accepted into a restorative justice program here. It involves meeting with victims' families, not Mr. Ashworth's. They've made it clear they want no contact, but families of other murder victims who want to understand why these crimes happen. It's painful work, hearing their grief, seeing the devastation that murder causes to those left behind, forces me to truly confront what I did. But it's also healing, in a strange way. Being able to help others, even slightly, feels like a small step toward making amends. I've also been thinking about the manuscripts, the ones my father helped steal. I've written to all the institutions affected, apologizing for my father's actions and my own failure to report them sooner. Most haven't responded, but a few have acknowledged my letters. Brother Simon from St. Benedict's even wrote back, offering prayers for my redemption. His kindness undid me completely. I don't expect forgiveness from those I've harmed, but I'm learning that redemption isn't about earning forgiveness from others. It's about becoming someone who would never make those choices again. Thank you for your patience with me, for not giving up even when I was at my worst. Your letters have been a lifeline." With deep gratitude, Cordelia Miss Marple showed this letter to Dr. Thornton, who wept openly. "She's becoming the person she was meant to be," the manuscript expert said, before grief and rage twisted her into someone unrecognizable. "I'm so grateful to you, Miss Marple, for helping her find this path." "I merely wrote letters," Miss Marple said modestly. Cordelia did the difficult work of transformation herself. As Miss Marple filed away the correspondence, she reflected on the strange journey that had begun with a poisoned manuscript at a Christmas fair. Cordelia Price would serve many more years in prison, might never gain parole, but she had found something perhaps more valuable: genuine remorse, real understanding, and a commitment to helping others avoid her mistakes. It wasn't a happy ending exactly. The dead remained dead, and lives remained shattered, but it was redemption of a sort, the kind that came through painful honesty and hard-won wisdom. Miss Marple thought of the Christmas Gospel with its beautiful illuminations of hope and salvation. Perhaps, in her own way, Cordelia was creating her own illumination, transforming the darkness of her crime into something that might, eventually, bring light to others. It was, Miss Marple reflected, the best one could hope for in such tragic circumstances. Chapter 9. The Monastery Dedication. 3 years after the trial, Miss Marple received an invitation embossed with gold leaf and bearing the seal of St. Benedict's Monastery. It was an invitation to a special dedication ceremony for the newly restored and rebound Christmas Gospel, which would be placed in a specially designed secure display in the monastery's library, where it could be viewed by scholars and visitors while remaining protected. The ceremony was scheduled for the week before Christmas, fitting given the manuscript's content and the season when the entire tragedy had begun. Miss Marple accepted the invitation and was pleased to learn that Dr. Thornton, Reverend Leonard, and even Inspector Slack had been invited as well. The day of the ceremony dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the ground like scattered diamonds. Miss Marple dressed carefully in her best coat and hat, knowing that this would be a significant occasion. Reverend Leonard collected her in his car, and they drove through the winter landscape toward the monastery. The countryside was beautiful in its starkness, bare trees etched against a pale blue sky. "It feels like closing a circle," the vicar observed. "When we first became involved with this case, it was also the Christmas season. Now, 3 years later, we're gathering to celebrate the manuscript's return to its rightful place, and to remember those who were lost along the way," Miss Marple added quietly. "Mr. Ashworth, Benedict Walker, and in a sense Cordelia Price as well, though she still lives." "Do you still correspond with her?" Reverend Leonard asked. "Occasionally," Miss Marple replied. "Her letters are less frequent now, but more thoughtful. She's become involved in teaching other inmates and has written a book about her experiences, hoping it might help others understand the consequences of taking justice into their own hands. Will it be published? Not until after her parole hearing, if she gets one. But the process of writing it has been therapeutic for her, I think. It forced her to examine every choice she made and to articulate why they were wrong. The monastery appeared ahead, its ancient walls solid and enduring. The car park was already filling with vehicles, and Miss Marple recognized several people from the original investigation making their way toward the entrance. Inside, the monastery chapel had been prepared for the ceremony. Rows of chairs faced an altar where the Christmas Gospel would be displayed one final time before being secured in its permanent home. The illuminations glowed in the candlelight, their gold leaf catching and reflecting the flames until the pages seemed almost alive. Abbot Thomas greeted each guest personally, his aged face wreathed in smiles. "Miss Marple, welcome back to St. Benedict's. We're so grateful you could join us for this celebration." "I wouldn't have missed it," Miss Marple replied warmly. "The manuscript looks magnificent. Brother Simon has overseen every aspect of its restoration and rebinding." The abbot gestured to where the young monk stood near the altar, speaking quietly with Dr. Thornton. "He's poured his heart into this work." As more guests arrived, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Inspector Slack, who looked uncomfortable in his formal suit but pleased to be present. "Quite a gathering," he observed. "Half the rare book world seems to be here. It's an important occasion." Miss Marple agreed, not just for the manuscript's return, but for what it represents. Beauty preserved and protected rather than exploited. The inspector nodded toward Dr. Thornton. "How is she managing? Do you know? Can't be easy, attending something like this given what happened to her. Family." "She's found peace, I think," Miss Marple said. "She's channeled her grief into her work, becoming one of the leading advocates for better security and documentation of rare manuscripts. She lectures frequently about the case, using it to educate institutions about protecting their collections. And the niece." any word. Cordelia is doing as well as can be expected, Miss Marple replied. She has her first parole hearing in 22 more years, but she's using her time constructively. Dr. Thornton visits regularly and says the transformation in her is profound. The ceremony began with the ringing of bells, their clear voices echoing through the chapel. Abbot Thomas led the congregation in prayer, thanking God for the manuscript's return and asking blessings on all those affected by the tragic events surrounding it. Brother Simon then gave a presentation about the manuscript's history, from its creation in the 12th century through its theft and eventual recovery. He spoke with obvious love and reverence for the illuminations, pointing out details that even experts might have missed. This rabbit in the corner of the flight into Egypt scene. He said, using a pointer to indicate a tiny creature partially hidden in the foliage. It symbolizes fertility and new life, a hopeful note in a scene depicting danger and flight. The medieval illuminator who painted this understood that even in darkness there are signs of hope. Miss Marple found herself deeply moved by the presentation. Brother Simon had transformed personal pain and anger into scholarly passion and preservation. He represented the best response to tragedy, channeling grief into constructive action. Dr. Thornton spoke next, addressing the gathering about manuscript security and the ongoing efforts to recover other stolen pages and documents from the Ashworth Walker theft ring. Her voice remained steady throughout, though Miss Marple noticed how her hands trembled slightly when she mentioned her brother. Benedict Walker was a gifted restorer who made terrible choices, Dr. Thornton said. His legacy is complicated, but I choose to remember not just his crimes, but also the beautiful work he created before greed corrupted him. I hope that by speaking honestly about what happened, I can help prevent others from following the same path. The highlight of the ceremony came when the manuscript was formally placed in its new display case, a climate-controlled, secure housing that would protect it while allowing it to be viewed. Abbot Thomas blessed the case and the manuscript, then invited everyone to come forward and see the illuminations one final time before they were sealed away. Miss Marple joined the queue, moving slowly forward until she stood before the open manuscript. The pages were turned to show the nativity scene, with Mary and Joseph gazing at the infant Jesus, surrounded by angels and the light of a divine star. "It's extraordinary, isn't it?" a voice beside her said. She turned to find a distinguished-looking gentleman in his 70s, whom she didn't recognize. "Quite extraordinary." Miss Marple agreed. The skill required to create something so beautiful with medieval tools and materials is almost unimaginable. The gentleman nodded. "I'm Thomas Ashworth, Edmund Ashworth's elder brother. I wanted to attend today to see what my brother died for, what drove him to such criminal behaviour." Miss Marple felt a rush of sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Ashworth." The man's expression was complicated. "Thank you. It's been difficult, knowing what Edmund did, the people he hurt. But seeing this manuscript, I understand a little better. Such beauty can drive people to obsession, to wanting to possess it at any cost. Though the better response is to appreciate and protect it," Miss Marple said gently, "as these monks have done for centuries." "Yes." Thomas Ashworth agreed. "That's the lesson, isn't it? Some things are not meant to be possessed privately, but shared and preserved for all." After the ceremony concluded, a reception was held in the monastery's refectory. The monks had prepared a feast of traditional Christmas foods, and the atmosphere was one of celebration mixed with solemnity. Miss Marple found herself seated between Reverend Leonard and Sister Agnes, who looked far more at peace than she had during the investigation. "This is a good day," Sister Agnes said softly. "Justice has been served in multiple ways. The manuscript is home, Cordelia Price has faced consequences for her crime, and we're all reminded of what's truly important." "And what is truly important?" Reverend Leonard asked gently. "That beauty and truth should serve a higher purpose than mere possession or profit," the nun replied. "These illuminations were created as acts of devotion. When they're viewed in that spirit, they elevate the soul. When they're treated as commodities, they corrupt it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "That's the heart of this entire tragedy, isn't it? Everyone involved, Mr. Ashworth, Benedict Walker, even Cordelia Price. They all treated the manuscript as a means to an end rather than as an end in itself. Only those who truly loved it for what it represented managed to avoid corruption. As the afternoon wore on, guests began departing. Miss Marple took one last walk through the monastery grounds, visiting the medicinal garden where Brother Simon's monkshood still grew, carefully tended and labelled. Brother Simon joined her there, his breath visible in the cold air. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple. It meant a great deal to have you here today." "I was honoured to be invited," she replied. "The ceremony was beautiful, and the manuscript is exactly where it belongs." The monk nodded. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness lately, about whether I can forgive Cordelia Price for what she did, using our sacred manuscript as a murder weapon." "And can you?" Miss Marple asked. Brother Simon was quiet for a long moment. "I think I can." She was driven by grief and a mistaken sense of justice. Her crime was terrible, but she's genuinely remorseful now. Your letters to her and her responses have been shared with me by Dr. Thornton. I can see the transformation in her thinking. Have you considered writing to her yourself? "I have written," the monk admitted. "Just recently. I told her that while I cannot condone what she did, I can forgive her for it, and I invited her, should she ever be released, to visit the monastery and see the manuscript properly displayed. I think it might help her understand that beauty can be redeemed from tragedy." Miss Marple felt tears prick her eyes. "That's extraordinarily generous of you, Brother Simon." The young monk smiled. "Forgiveness is at the heart of our faith, Miss Marple. Without it, we're all lost." As Reverend Leonard drove Miss Marple back to St. Mary Mead that evening, the winter sun setting in brilliant orange and pink, they discussed the day's events. It felt like a true closing. The vicar observed, "Not a happy ending exactly, but a resolution that acknowledges both the tragedy and the possibility of redemption." "Yes." Miss Marple agreed. "The manuscript is preserved, those who committed crimes have faced or are facing justice, and those who were victims are finding peace. It's as good an outcome as one could hope for in such circumstances. Do you think Cordelia Price will ever see the manuscript again, if she's eventually paroled?" Miss Marple considered this. "I hope so." Brother Simon's invitation was sincere, and if Cordelia continues on her current path, if she truly becomes someone who understands the value of beauty and the importance of justice, then seeing the manuscript displayed properly might be the final piece of her redemption. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, watching the countryside darken as night approached. Finally, Reverend Leonard spoke again. "You know, throughout this entire case, I kept thinking about the nativity story depicted in those illuminations. Mary and Joseph fleeing to Egypt to protect the infant Jesus from those who would harm him. In a strange way, the manuscript itself had to be protected from those who would harm it, whether through theft, exploitation, or use as a murder weapon." "That's a profound observation," Miss Marple said. "And now it's safe, guarded by those who understand its true value and purpose. Perhaps that's the real Christmas message in all of this, that what is sacred must be protected, and those who threaten it must face consequences. But even they can find redemption if they're willing to seek it." As they arrived back in St. Mary Mead, the village was preparing for Christmas. Lights twinkled in windows, wreaths hung on doors, and the church bells were ringing for evening service. Normal, peaceful village life, continuing its eternal rhythm. Miss Marple thanked Reverend Leonard for the ride and made her way into her cottage, where her housekeeper had left the fire burning and tea prepared. She settled into her favourite chair with her knitting, reflecting on the day's ceremony and on the long, strange journey that had begun 3 years earlier with a poisoned manuscript at an antiquarian fair. The case was truly closed now, not just legally, but spiritually. The manuscript was home, the guilty had been punished or were being rehabilitated, and the innocent had found peace. It was, Miss Marple thought, as close to a satisfactory resolution as one could hope for in a case involving murder. She thought of Cordelia Price, sitting in her prison cell, perhaps reading or working in the library, carrying the weight of her crime, but also the hope of eventual redemption. She thought of Dr. Thornton, visiting her niece faithfully despite the pain it caused. She thought of Brother Simon, tending both his manuscript and his garden with equal devotion, and she thought of the illuminations themselves, glowing in their secure case, available now for scholars and visitors to admire, to study, and to be inspired by. Beauty preserved, truth acknowledged, and justice, however imperfectly, served. Outside her window, St. Mary Mead settled into winter evening. The case of the Christmas manuscript murder had been solved, its perpetrator punished, and its victims remembered. Now it would become part of village history, another story to be told over teacups and at parish gatherings, another reminder that human nature in all its complexity remained endlessly fascinating and occasionally tragic. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she worked on her current project, a complex pattern that required all her attention and skill. Much like solving murders, she reflected with a slight smile. One simply had to pay attention, follow the threads, and trust that eventually the pattern would reveal itself. And so it always did. Chapter 10. The Christmas Redemption. 5 years after the murder, on a cold December morning, much like the one when the tragedy had first unfolded, Miss Marple received an unexpected telephone call from Dr. Patricia Thornton. "Miss Marple, I have news." The manuscript expert's voice was thick with emotion. "Cordelia is being granted early parole. The hearing was yesterday, and they've decided to release her after serving just 8 years. She'll be out in time for Christmas." Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. "That's remarkable. Early release is quite rare in murder cases. Her exemplary behaviour and the extensive work she's done with restorative justice programs made the difference," Dr. Thornton explained. "She's helped dozens of inmates, taught literacy classes, and her book about the dangers of vigilante justice has been circulated within the prison system as an educational tool. The parole board felt she represented genuine rehabilitation. How does Cordelia feel about it?" "Terrified," Dr. Thornton admitted. "She's been in prison for 8 years. The world has changed, and she's changed. She's not sure she knows how to live on the outside anymore, especially carrying the weight of what she did." "Where will she go when she's released?" "She'll stay with me initially. I have a cottage in the countryside, quiet and private. She'll need time to adjust before facing the wider world." Miss Marple considered this news throughout the day. That evening she sat down and wrote a letter. "Dear Cordelia, Dr. Thornton has told me the wonderful news of your parole. Congratulations on this opportunity for a new beginning. I know you must be feeling anxious about re-entering the world after so long, but I want you to know that you have supporters who believe in your rehabilitation and your capacity for good. You've done difficult, honest work on yourself these past 8 years. That work will continue, but you're prepared for it now in ways you weren't before. Brother Simon has asked me to remind you of his invitation to visit St. Benedict's Monastery when you feel ready. He genuinely wishes to see you and to show you the manuscript properly displayed. I think it might provide closure for both of you. Remember that redemption is not a destination, but a journey. You will make mistakes as you adjust to freedom. You will have difficult days, but you have learned the most important lesson, that every human life has value, and justice must be pursued through proper channels, never through personal vengeance. I look forward to seeing you again when you're ready. With warm regards, Jane Marple." 3 weeks later, on Christmas Eve, Miss Marple answered her door to find Cordelia Price standing on her doorstep. The young woman looked thin and nervous, her hair shorter than Miss Marple remembered, her face bearing the marks of her years in prison, premature lines around the eyes, a guarded expression. "Miss Marple," Cordelia said hesitantly, "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to thank you in person for your letters and your support." "Not at all, dear. Come in out of the cold." Miss Marple ushered her inside, noting how Cordelia's eyes darted nervously around the cottage, unused to the freedom of movement. Over tea and fresh scones they talked. Cordelia spoke haltingly about her adjustment to life outside prison, the overwhelming nature of simple choices, the constant awareness of her crime and its consequences. "I went to the cemetery yesterday," Cordelia said quietly, "to Mr. Ashworth's grave. I left flowers and spent an hour there, just sitting and thinking about what I took from the world when I killed him." "That took courage," Miss Marple observed. "His sister was there." Cordelia continued, her voice breaking slightly. She recognized me from the trial. I thought she would be angry, would tell me to leave. But instead she just looked at me for a long moment and then said, "At least you came." We didn't speak beyond that, but somehow it felt like a beginning. Miss Marple reached across and patted Cordelia's hand. Healing takes time, and it's not linear. Some days will be harder than others. But the fact that you went to his grave, that you acknowledged his humanity and your crime, that's significant progress. "Brother Simon has invited me to the monastery for their Christmas service tonight," Cordelia said, "to see the manuscript. I'm not sure I'm ready." "Only you can decide that," Miss Marple replied. "But I think it might help you see that beauty can survive tragedy, that sacred things can be redeemed even after they've been misused." That evening, Miss Marple, Cordelia, Dr. Thornton, and Reverend Leonard drove together to St. Benedict's Monastery. The ancient building glowed with candlelight, and the sound of monks chanting drifted through the cold air. Brother Simon met them at the entrance, greeting Cordelia with gentle warmth and no hint of judgment. The young woman broke down in tears, apologizing repeatedly for what she had done. "You've been forgiven," Brother Simon said firmly. "By God, by me, and by this community. Now you must learn to forgive yourself and move forward in a way that honors the life you took." The Christmas service was beautiful, filled with ancient hymns and prayers that had been recited in that chapel for centuries. Afterward, Brother Simon took them to the library where the manuscript was displayed. Cordelia stood before the illuminations for a long time, tears streaming down her face. The nativity scene glowed in the carefully controlled lighting. Mary and Joseph bending over the infant Jesus, angels hovering above, the star shining brilliantly. "I used these to kill someone," Cordelia whispered. "I took these beautiful, sacred images and turned them into murder weapons. How can that ever be forgiven?" "Because you've changed," Brother Simon said gently. "The woman who poisoned those pages is not the woman standing here now. You've done the hard work of transformation, of genuine remorse and growth. The manuscript has been cleansed and restored. So can you be." Cordelia turned to him, her face anguished. "But I can never undo what I did. Mr. Ashworth is still dead because of me." "No, you cannot undo it," the monk agreed. "That's the burden you must carry. But you can ensure that his death and your crime serve a purpose. You can help others understand the dangers of vengeance. You can advocate for proper justice. You can live a life that honors the hard lessons you've learned." As they prepared to leave, Abbot Thomas approached Cordelia with a small package. "We'd like you to have this," he said. "It's a reproduction of one of the illuminations from our Christmas Gospel, the flight into Egypt with the small rabbit symbolizing hope and new life. Let it remind you that even in the darkest times, even when fleeing from danger and facing an uncertain future, there is always hope for redemption." Cordelia accepted the gift with trembling hands, unable to speak through her tears. The drive back to St. Mary Mead was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. When they reached Miss Marple's cottage, Cordelia asked if she might come in for a moment. Inside, warmed by the fire and holding a cup of tea, Cordelia spoke more freely than she had all evening. "I've spent 8 years preparing for this day, for the chance to leave prison and start over. But now that it's here, I'm terrified. What if I can't do it? What if the weight of what I did crushes me? What if people can't see past my crime to whoever I've become?" Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at the young woman with compassion. "Cordelia, redemption is not about erasing the past or escaping consequences. It's about accepting what you've done, learning from it, and choosing to live differently going forward. You will always be someone who committed murder. That's a fact that cannot be changed. But you can also be someone who learned from that terrible choice, who helps others avoid similar mistakes, and who lives with integrity and purpose." Dr. Thornton, who had been listening quietly, added, "You have talents and knowledge that can be used for good. Your understanding of manuscripts, your experience with the criminal justice system, your journey through remorse to redemption, all of these can serve others. You've already helped so many inmates through your work. Imagine what you could do with your freedom." Cordelia wiped her eyes. "I've been offered a position," she said hesitantly. a non-profit that works with at-risk youth, trying to steer them away from criminal behaviour. They want me to speak about my experiences, to serve as a warning about how easily one can rationalise terrible actions. I wasn't sure if I should accept. Why wouldn't you? Reverend Leonard asked gently. Because I'm a murderer, Cordelia said bluntly. Why would anyone listen to me? Why should anyone trust me? Because you understand both sides, Miss Marple said firmly. You know what it's like to feel justified in taking justice into your own hands. You know the thought processes that lead someone to rationalise murder, and you know the devastating consequences and the long, painful road to genuine remorse. That knowledge is valuable, Cordelia. Use it. Cordelia looked at each of them in turn, these people who had stood by her through the worst period of her life. I don't deserve your support and kindness. Perhaps not. Miss Marple agreed with characteristic honesty. But redemption isn't about deserving. It's about grace, about being given opportunities for transformation despite our failures. What you do with those opportunities is up to you. As Cordelia and Dr. Thornton prepared to leave, Cordelia turned back once more. Miss Marple, may I ask you something? Throughout all of this, you never condemned me. You acknowledged what I did was wrong, but you never treated me as irredeemable. Why? Miss Marple smiled slightly. Because I've lived long enough to know that human nature is complex and capable of both terrible evil and profound good, sometimes in the same person. You made a terrible choice driven by grief and rage, but you've also shown the courage to face what you did, to change fundamentally, and to seek ways to prevent others from following your path. That deserves acknowledgement and support. After they left, Miss Marple sat by her fire, reflecting on the strange and winding path that had brought them all to this Christmas Eve. A murder committed 5 years ago had been solved, justice served, and now, incredibly, a kind of redemption achieved. She thought about the Christmas Gospel with its beautiful illuminations, about the medieval monks who had created them as acts of devotion, never imagining they would one day be used as instruments of death. She thought about Edmund Ashworth, whose greed had led him to theft and murder. She thought about Benedict Walker, whose talents had been corrupted by the promise of wealth, and she thought about Cordelia Price, who had allowed grief to drive her to murder, but who had found, through years of painful work, a path toward genuine transformation. The doorbell rang, surprising her. She opened it to find a delivery person holding a small package. For you, Miss Marple. Special delivery. Inside was a beautiful bound copy of a book titled The Price of Vengeance by Cordelia Price. A note was tucked inside. Dear Miss Marple, this is the book I wrote in prison, now finally published. It's dedicated to everyone affected by my crime, especially Mr. Ashworth and his family. I hope it might help prevent others from making the choices I made. The first copy belongs to you, whose wisdom and kindness helped guide me toward redemption. With eternal gratitude, Cordelia Miss Marple opened the book and read the dedication page. For Edmund Ashworth, whose life I took. For my father, Benedict Walker, whose death I tried to avenge. For all those harmed by violence masquerading as justice. May we learn that vengeance and justice are not the same, and that all human life has value, even those who wrong us. She read late into the night, following Cordelia's journey from grief to rage to murder to eventual remorse and understanding. It was painful reading, unflinching in its honesty about the thought processes that had led to murder and the slow, agonizing realization of how wrong those thoughts had been. The final chapter was titled Redemption and What It Costs. In it, Cordelia wrote about the ongoing nature of making amends, about living with the knowledge of having taken a life, and about the commitment to ensuring that her crime would serve as a warning rather than merely a tragedy. She wrote, I cannot bring Edmund Ashworth back. I cannot undo the pain I caused his family, my aunt, and everyone else affected by my crime. But I can commit to living in a way that honours the lessons learned through terrible experience. I can work to prevent others from rationalising violence. I can speak honestly about how easy it is to convince yourself that vengeance is justice. And I can spend the rest of my life trying to add more good to the world than the evil I introduced through murder. Miss Marple closed the book as midnight approached, the bells of St. Mary Mead's Church beginning to ring in Christmas Day. She thought about the true meaning of the season, about redemption and forgiveness, about hope and new beginnings. The case of the Christmas manuscript murder had taught many lessons about the corruption that comes from treating beauty as commodity, about the danger of taking justice into one's own hands, about the devastating consequences of violence, even when motivated by love and grief. But it had also taught lessons about the possibility of transformation, about the power of forgiveness, and about the long, difficult road to genuine redemption. As the church bells rang out their message of hope and renewal, Miss Marple said a quiet prayer for all those touched by the tragedy, for Edmund Ashworth, that his death might not be meaningless, for Benedict Walker, that his mistakes might serve as warnings, for Cordelia Price, that her transformation might be lasting and her future work might help others, and for all those who had been hurt by the tragedy, that they might find peace. The manuscript had been restored, justice had been served, and now, incredibly, redemption had been achieved. Not the easy redemption of absolution, but the hard-won redemption of genuine transformation and lifelong commitment to making amends. Outside, snow began to fall softly on St. Mary Mead, covering the village in pristine white. A new day was beginning, Christmas Day, a day celebrating hope and renewal and the possibility of redemption, even for the most broken among us. Miss Marple extinguished her lamp and made her way to bed, carrying with her the knowledge that even in the darkest tragedies, even in cases involving premeditated murder and shattered lives, there remained the possibility of grace, transformation, and hope. The Christmas manuscript murder had been solved years ago, but its true resolution, the redemption of its perpetrator, and the healing of those harmed, was only now coming to fruition. It was, Miss Marple reflected, as sleep claimed her, perhaps the most important mystery of all. How broken people could be made whole again, how terrible choices could lead eventually to profound wisdom, and how justice and mercy could coexist. The illuminations in the Christmas Gospel depicted the Nativity story, a story fundamentally about hope, redemption, and the possibility of transformation. How fitting that a manuscript carrying those images should itself become part of a story about those same themes. As Christmas Day dawned over St. Mary Mead, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings, the case of the Christmas manuscript murder reached its true conclusion, not in a courtroom or a prison, but in the quiet transformation of a human soul and in the forgiveness offered by those who had every right to withhold it. It was, Miss Marple thought in her last moments before sleep, the best possible ending to a tragedy. Not a happy ending, for the dead remained dead, and the pain remained real, but a redemptive one, where even the worst mistakes could become opportunities for growth, learning, and ultimate transformation. And in that redemption lay hope for all of humanity, the hope that we are none of us defined solely by our worst actions, that change is possible, and that grace, when combined with genuine remorse and committed effort, can transform even the most broken among us into sources of wisdom and healing for others. The bells continued their Christmas song, ringing out over the sleeping village, carrying their message of hope, redemption, and peace to all who would hear. The end.